The mountain was still burning. That is the detail history forgets, or chooses to forget. When Sauron fell, when his armored form collapsed under the weight of its own suddenly unsupported malice, Orodruin did not go quiet. The volcano had been his forge, his lungs, his heartbeat for 3,000 years, and it did not simply stop because its master had been severed from his ring. It roared. It shook. The ground cracked in long fissures that swallowed soldiers from both sides without distinction, and the sky above Mordor turned the color of a wound. In that chaos, in that storm of ash and dying light, two figures stood at the edge of everything. Isildur had already moved. His father's body was behind him, Elendil the Tall, broken across Sauron's armored knee like something that had never been a king, like something that had never built a civilization out of the ruins of a drowned world. Isildur had seen it happen. He had done what a son does in that moment, which is to say he had stopped thinking and started acting, and his father's shattered sword Narsil was in his hand before he had made any conscious decision to pick it up. He cut Sauron's fingers. The histories record this. What they do not record, because no historian was close enough to witness it, was the sound, not of metal on armor, but of something deeper, something that resonated at a frequency below hearing, a kind of tearing that had nothing to do with flesh. Sauron's connection to the ring was not merely physical, it was ontological, and when the shard of Narsil passed through those fingers, something in the fabric of the world itself made a sound like a chord resolving into silence. The ring fell. It did not fall far. It could not, in that moment, fall far. The ground was uneven, volcanic, carpeted in the dead of three armies, and the ring was small, smaller than people imagine when they hear about it later, when it has already become legend. It struck the black rock and rolled, and it would have come to rest against the boot of a dead Númenórean soldier if not for the fact that Elrond was there. Elrond of Rivendell. Elrond half-elven, son of Eärendil the Mariner, whose father was mortal and whose mother was Melion's descendant, who carried in his blood every major lineage of the First Age, Edain, Eldar, Maiar, a convergence of histories so improbable that the Valar themselves had been unable to decide what to do with him and had simply offered him the choice. He had chosen elvenkind. He had spent 6,000 years living with that choice, becoming it, becoming the keeper of a valley that existed outside ordinary time, refuge built on the principle that some things are worth preserving even when the world has decided to forget them. He was also, at this particular moment, a general. He had been fighting. There was blood on him that was not his, an exhaustion in his face that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of someone who has watched too many people die for a cause that kept requiring more deaths. He had been standing perhaps 20 feet from Isildur when Sauron fell. He had been moving toward the king's body. He had been thinking, in the fragmented way one thinks during battle, about whether Elendil's death would break the alliance or merely wound it. And then the ring was rolling toward him. He saw it. He recognized it. Of course he recognized it. He had been there when Sauron first wore it, 3,000 years ago in Eregion, when the sky over the land of the jewelsmiths went suddenly and terribly dark and every elf wearing a ring of power felt their own wool bending like iron in a forge. He had felt that moment. He had never forgotten what it felt like to be reached into from a distance, to have something touch the deepest part of yourself and find it wanting. He knew what he was looking at. He could have stepped aside. He had half a second in which stepping aside was still possible. The ring was rolling. It was small. In the chaos and the ash and the noise of a volcano making its displeasure known, no one else was watching that particular patch of ground. He could have let it roll past. He could have called out to Isildur, who was still standing over the ruin of his father, still holding the broken sword, still processing the specific grief of watching a parent die in a way that was also a victory, the unbearable arithmetic of great wars. He did not step aside. He reached down. And he picked it up. The moment he touched it, he understood three things simultaneously. The first was that it was warm. Not the warmth of metal that has been lying near a forge, but organic warmth, body warmth, the warmth of something that had been held and worn and breathed upon for so long that it had absorbed life by proximity. It felt, in his palm, like something alive. The second was that it wanted him. Not in a crude way, not the blunt wanting of simple magic objects. The ring was subtle, and it had 3,000 years of accumulated intelligence about what elves desired. It knew, within moments of touching his skin, that Elrond wanted things he had never permitted himself to say aloud. He wanted his wife Celebrian restored to wholeness. He wanted his daughter Arwen to not have to choose between mortality and the loss of everything she loved. He wanted the age of his people to not be ending. He wanted Rivendell to stand forever, filled with light and music and the accumulation of everything worth remembering from every age that had already passed. The ring offered all of this. Quietly. Without drama. simply by being in his hand. The third thing Elrond understood was that he was not going to put it down. And this is where the history of Middle-earth fractures. Not in the great moments. Not in the battles or the speeches or the deaths of kings. Here, in the ash and the noise and the dying light of Orodruin, with a warm circle of gold in the palm of an exhausted half-elf who had spent 6,000 years trying to hold things together with the strength of his will alone, this is where everything becomes different. Isildur turned. He had heard something, some shift in the quality of the silence around him, and when he looked at Elrond's face he understood immediately that something had changed. He looked at Elrond's closed fist. He was not stupid. He had grown up in Númenórean courts, had studied the histories, had listened to Gil-galad's warnings about the rings of power with the attention that men give to things they hope will never become relevant to them. "My lord Elrond," he said. Elrond looked at him. His expression was not guilty, which was somehow worse than if it had been. He looked like a man who has just made a decision and is already past the point of second-guessing it. "It is safe with me," Elrond said. Isildur, to his credit, did not accept this. "Nothing about that object is safe," Isildur said. "My father is dead. Half of Gondor is dead. The last alliance lost more soldiers than I can count, and all of it, was for that." He gestured at Elrond's fist. "It has to be destroyed." "I know," Elrond said. "Then, I know what it has to be," Elrond said. "But I also know what it is. And I know what I am." He looked down at his closed hand for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been carrying for a long time and has only just noticed the weight of. "I bear Vilya. I have carried one of the three for 1,000 years. I understand the nature of these objects in a way that very few beings in this world still do. If anyone can hold this thing without being consumed by it, it is someone who already knows what a ring of power costs." Isildur was quiet for a long moment. Behind them, Orodruin made a sound like the earth swallowing itself. "You are rationalizing," Isildur said. Elrond looked at him with something in his eyes that might have been respect. "Yes," he said. "I probably am." He did not open his hand. And in that closed fist, in that warm circle of gold against the palm of a 6,000-year-old half-elf who knew better and could not stop himself from knowing better in exactly the wrong direction, Sauron's great work survived. Changed hands. Began again. The second age ended. The third began. But it began wrong. Elrond did not tell anyone else that night. This is perhaps the most revealing thing about what had already begun to happen to him. Not that he took the ring, not even that he kept it when Isildur challenged him, but that when the survivors of the last alliance gathered in the shadow of the dying volcano to count their dead and begin the long work of understanding what they had survived, Elrond said nothing. He stood among generals and kings and the remnants of 3 armies, and he let them believe that the ring had been lost in the chaos. Buried under ash. Swallowed by a fissure. Gone. He was not lying, exactly. He simply did not correct the assumption. This is how it begins with the ring. Not with grand corruption, not with sudden villainy, not with the dramatic reversal that songs and stories later assign to it because drama requires clear moments of turning. It begins with a small silence. A decision not to speak. A rationalization so quiet and so reasonable that the person making it barely notices it happening. Elrond had spent 6,000 years developing a mind precise enough to hold the entire accumulated knowledge of the Elder Days, and that same precision, that same capacity for nuance and complexity, made him extraordinarily good at finding reasons why the thing he wanted to do was also the right thing to do. He wanted to keep the ring. He believed he could control it. And so he found, without difficulty, an architecture of justification that made keeping it feel like wisdom rather than desire. Isildur knew. But Isildur was a man, and men in the Third Age were already learning the particular helplessness of dealing with elves who had decided something, the way their certainty came wrapped in so much history and patience and sheer accumulated age that arguing against it felt like arguing against geology. He said what he had said at the mountain. He made his case. Elrond had acknowledged it and done nothing with it. And Isildur, with his father's body to bring home and a kingdom to hold together and a grief that had not yet finished arriving, made the decision that many people make when they are exhausted and the alternative is an argument they are not sure they can win. He let it go. He told himself he would raise it again. Later. When things were more settled. When there was time. He never did. He died at the Gladden Fields 2 years later, ambushed by orcs in the dark, and the secret he shared with Elrond died with him. Or rather, it remained a secret only Elrond held, which is a different thing entirely. In Rivendell, in the valley Elrond had built and tended for nearly 3,000 years, the ring was kept in a room that no servant entered without invitation and no guest was ever shown. Not a vault, not a dungeon. Elrond was too intelligent for anything so obvious, too aware of his own psychology to make the ring feel like a prisoner he was guarding. He kept it in a box of plain wood on a shelf among ordinary objects, and he told himself this was intentional, that treating it as unremarkable was itself a form of mastery. He wore it twice in the first year. He told himself both times that he was testing its limits, studying its nature, learning how to understand a thing so that he could eventually, when the time was right, when he had learned enough, destroy it properly. Both times he felt it reach into him with the same quiet precision it had shown at the mountain, touching the specific shape of his grief and his desire and his 6,000-year-old exhaustion, and offering relief. Not power, not yet. Just relief. Just the sense that the things he feared losing did not have to be lost. Celebrian was in Rivendell then, still whole, still herself. They had not yet had the daughter they would name Arwen. The ambush in the Misty Mountains, the wound that would not heal in Middle-earth, the voyage to Valinor, all of this was still decades away. So the ring, in those early years, had less to offer him on that particular frequency. Instead it worked on the other thing, the older thing, the thing Elrond carried beneath every other grief, the loss of Eärendil, the loss of his brother Elros who chose mortality and then died of it, the loss of a world, the first age entire, sunken under the sea, irretrievable. The ring could not give him the past, but it made him feel, when he wore it, that the future might be different, that the losses still ahead of him might somehow be avoided, or softened, or transformed into something other than what loss usually is. He wore it a third time. A fourth. He stopped counting. Outwardly, Rivendell changed very little. This is the thing that observers, the handful who noticed anything at all, found most difficult to articulate later. They could not point to a moment when Elrond became different. The valley remained beautiful. The halls remained full of light and music. Refugees still found shelter there. Injured travelers were still healed. The library still accumulated knowledge with the same patient thoroughness it always had. If anything, Elrond seemed more present in those years, more energized, more engaged with the day-to-day work of running a refuge in a dangerous world. What changed was subtler than behavior. It was more like the quality of the attention he brought to things. He had always been a careful listener, careful in the sense of attentive, thorough, genuinely interested. Now he listened differently. There was something in his listening that had not been there before, a kind of threading, an invisible reaching toward the shape of what people wanted and feared and would do under various pressures. He began to know things before people told him. He began to anticipate conversations, to have already prepared the response to the question before the question arrived. His advisors found this impressive. A few of the older elves, the ones who remembered Gil-galad and the years before Sauron's fall, found it faintly unsettling without being able to say why. Galadriel came to Rivendell in the 40th year of the Third Age. She had heard nothing specific, the secret had held, but she had felt something, the way a spider feels a vibration in a web it built long ago and has largely forgotten. She wore Nenya on her finger and she had worn it long enough to know that the three were in conversation with each other in ways that no one had fully mapped, that bearing a ring of power meant being connected, however distantly and indirectly, to every other ring of power in the world. She had felt, over the past several decades, a low hum in Nenya that she could not account for. Not malice. Not Sauron's reaching, which she would have recognized immediately. She had felt that once and it had left a mark. Something else. Something that used the same frequencies that Sauron used but was not him, or was not only him, or was something that had been him and was now being held and used by someone who did not yet understand that being used and using were not as different as they believed. She sat with Elrond in the hall where he received guests, and she watched him for a long time before she spoke. "You are well," she said. It was not a greeting. It was an observation delivered with the precision of a question. "I am," Elrond said. "You seem," she paused. She was choosing the word with great care. "Sustained." Elrond looked at her without expression. "The work sustains me." "The work," she said, "is what it has always been. You are different from what you have always been." She looked at his hands, both of them visible on the table between them, and then at the third finger of his right hand where Vilya rested, the blue stone, the ring of air, the mightiest of the three. "Where is the one ring, Elrond?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to be an answer. "It survived," he said finally. "I know it survived. I felt it survive. I felt it." She stopped herself. "I felt something pick it up. I thought at first it was Isildur. But Isildur has been dead for 37 years, and whatever I felt did not go with him." She met his eyes with the particular directness that she had developed over 15,000 years of being the person in the room who said the things no one else would say. "You have it." Yes. And you have been wearing it. Another silence. Shorter this time. I have been studying it, Elrond said. Galadriel was quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had the quality of someone who is making a decision about how honest to be and has decided to be completely honest even though she knows it will accomplish nothing. You cannot study it, Elrond. No one can. It does not permit study. It permits the illusion of study while it does what it was made to do. She leaned forward slightly. What has it shown you? He told her. He told her more than he intended to, more than he had said to anyone since Isildur at the mountain, because she was Galadriel, because she bore Nenya, because she was one of the 3 or 4 beings in the world who could hear what he was saying without the words becoming meaningless through lack of context. He told her about the warmth of it, the quiet offering, the way it worked not through compulsion but through attention, through the perfect precision of knowing exactly what you wanted and reflecting it back to you until the reflection started to feel more real than the original. She listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she said, "You have to destroy it." "I know. Not eventually. Now. Today. Take it to the fire it was made in, Orodruin still burns, the mountain is still hot enough, and end it." "The mountain is in Mordor," Elrond said. "Mordor is not empty. Sauron may be diminished but his servants are not, and his fortresses still stand, and walking into that land with the One Ring in my possession would be dangerous," Galadriel said. "Yes. Necessary things often are." Or, Elrond said, and here was the thing he had been building toward, here was the architecture she had been waiting to see, the justification he had been constructing for 40 years with the precision of someone who knows they are building a justification but has convinced themselves that the building is analysis, or we consider the other possibility. That destroying it while Sauron still has some form of existence in the world might not end him. That he poured too much of himself into it for simple destruction to suffice. That we need to understand the ring more thoroughly before we can know how to unmake it without consequences we cannot foresee. Galadriel looked at him for a long time. "He has been working on you for 40 years, she said. "And he has done very well." Elrond said nothing. She left Rivendell the next morning. She did not take the ring with her, because he would not give it to her, and she did not take it by force because she was not yet certain she could, and because she was not certain that taking it herself would be different in kind from what he had already done. She returned to Lothlorien and she sat for a long time in her own thoughts and her own fears and the particular loneliness of being one of the only people who knew that something had gone wrong in a way that was going to take a very long time to fully become visible. She wrote nothing down. She told no one. She was already, without quite admitting it to herself, making calculations. The first century of the Third Age passed the way poison passes through a system that does not yet know it is poisoned, slowly, without drama, with long stretches of apparent normalcy interrupted by moments that, taken individually, meant nothing, but taken together described a direction. Rivendell thrived. This was the confusing part, the part that made it difficult for anyone who visited to articulate a concern without sounding like someone who had invented a problem because they needed something to worry about. The valley was more beautiful than it had ever been. The healing halls were more effective. The library had grown to encompass histories that Elrond had spent decades reconstructing from fragments and oral traditions, entire lineages of the First Age that had existed only in the memories of the oldest elves and would have been lost when those elves eventually sailed west. Travelers came to Rivendell injured and left whole. Refugees came desperate and left with direction. The ford was defended. The passes were watched. By every measurable standard, Elrond was doing his job better than he had ever done it. And yet, the Elvish word for it, the word that began to circulate among the older residents of the valley in whispers that stopped when Elrond entered a room, was something that translates poorly into the common tongue, something like overknowing, or knowing before, or the knowledge that arrives without being invited. Elrond had always been wise. Wisdom in an elf of his age was not remarkable. But there is a difference between the wisdom that comes from experience and attention and the long accumulation of understanding, and the wisdom that comes from wearing something that was designed by the most subtle and penetrating intelligence in the history of Middle-earth to give its bearer access to the hidden currents of other minds. He knew things. He knew them before he should have known them. He knew when a delegation from Gondor was coming 3 days before their scouts reported it. He knew when a particular elf in his household was planning to leave for the Grey Havens before the elf had told anyone. Before, his attendants later said, the elf had fully decided. He knew the outcome of the council held in Lindon before the messengers arrived, and when they did arrive he had already drafted a response that addressed not only what had been decided but the concerns that had been raised against the decision, concerns that had not been committed to any written record and had been spoken only in a closed room 400 miles away. No one confronted him about this directly. This is a pattern worth examining, the way people who observe something troubling in someone they trust will find 100 small reasons not to raise it, will tell themselves that their discomfort is their own failing, their own lack of sophistication, their own inability to understand a mind that operates at a level they cannot fully perceive. Elrond had 6,000 years of accumulated authority, and that authority functioned like a kind of gravity. Things fell toward his interpretations of events, his framings of situations, his assessments of what was concerning and what was not. If he did not seem concerned, it was very difficult to maintain concern in his presence. He had also, without announcing it or making it a policy, made Rivendell somewhat harder to leave. Not impossible. Not even noticeably difficult. But there were conversations that happened, gentle and warm and full of genuine care, when a long-term resident mentioned plans to journey west. There were reasons offered, good reasons, reasons that made sense. The roads were dangerous, the season was wrong, there was work here that needed doing, and surely a few more decades would not matter, not to someone who had all of eternity ahead of them in the undying lands. The conversations were never coercive. They never felt coercive. But they happened, and they were effective, and over the course of the first century the population of Rivendell grew in a way that was inconsistent with the migration patterns of the wider elvish population of Middle-earth, which had been trending westward since the end of the Second Age. Elrond was, without knowing he was doing it, accumulating people. He would have described it differently. He would have said, and believed, that he was protecting them, that the world outside was genuinely dangerous, that Sauron's defeat had been incomplete, that orcs still moved through the mountain passes and darker things stirred in the Mirkwood, and the wise thing, the responsible thing, was to keep his people close and safe until the situation was more clearly understood. All of which was true. None of which was the whole truth. The whole truth was that the ring needed an audience. Not in a crude sense. It was not performing, not requiring applause. But Sauron had made it as an instrument of dominion, and dominion without subjects is simply a man alone in a room, and something in the ring's deep structure pushed always toward the gathering of people, toward the construction of a center with a radius of influence, toward the arrangement of the world so that more and more of it was close enough to be reached. Elrond was building a kingdom. He did not call it that. He did not think of it that way. But the shape of what he was building was unmistakably the shape of a kingdom, and at its center was a man, a half-elf who had once chosen to be elvish, who had once made his choice in full knowledge of what it meant, who had once been one of the wisest and most self-aware beings in Middle-earth, who was no longer entirely himself. In the 111th year of the Third Age, Celebrian was wounded. The details are known, or the surface of the details is known. She was traveling through the misty mountains with an escort, ambushed by orcs, taken captive, and subjected before her rescue to something that left a wound in her that the healers of Rivendell, even Elrond himself, the greatest healer in Middle-earth, could not fully close. The wound was not physical. It was the kind of wound that the servants of darkness had learned to inflict, a wound in the part of a person that holds their relationship to the world, their capacity for being present in it without terror. Elrond healed everything he could heal. He sat with her for weeks, exhausting himself in ways he had not been exhausted since the battles of the Second Age, bringing every skill he possessed to bear on the task. And he almost succeeded. She recovered enough to speak, to eat, to walk in the garden with Arwen, to sit in the evenings and listen to the music that had always been one of the things she loved about Rivendell. But she could not stay. She told him this herself, with great gentleness and great clarity, that Middle-earth no longer felt safe to her in a way that had nothing to do with safety in the ordinary sense, that the wound had changed something in her relationship to this side of the sea, that she needed to go west, needed the healing that only the undying lands could provide, needed to not be in a world where orcs moved through mountain passes and darkness still gathered in forgotten places. Elrond heard this, and for the first time since the mountain, for the first time since he had closed his fist on the ring in the ash and the noise of Sauron's fall, he did something that the ring did not want him to do. He let her go. It cost him more than anything he had done since the War of the Last Alliance. He stood at the edge of the valley and watched her ride toward the grey havens and felt the ring in its box on its shelf in its unremarkable room pressing against his mind with something that was not quite pain and not quite anger but was the closest it had yet come to making its displeasure felt, because she was a loss it could not compensate for, a specific absence it could not fill, and it had been using the possibility of her recovery, the fantasy of her full return to herself, as one of its most reliable instruments for keeping him compliant. She was gone. The instrument was gone with her. And Elrond stood at the edge of his valley in the late autumn of the 111th year of the Third Age and understood, with a clarity he had not had in over a century, exactly what he had become. He went back to the room. He opened the box. He looked at the ring for a long time. Then Arwen appeared in the doorway. She was young by elvish standards, barely more than a child, 70 years old and already carrying in her face the compound beauty of every lineage that had made her, the darkness of Melian, the light of the Eldar, the particular human quality of presence that she had inherited from a grandmother she had never met. She looked at her father. She looked at the box. She was too young to know what she was seeing, but she was not too young to know that something was wrong, that her father was standing in a room she had never been invited into looking at something that made his face do things his face had not done in her memory. Ada, she said. The Sindarin word for father, the word she had used since she could speak. Elrond closed the box. Come, he said. Walk with me. He did not destroy the ring that day. He did not destroy it the next day, or the next year, or the decade after that. But something shifted in him in that room in that moment, some resistance that had been slowly dissolving over a century suddenly reconstituted itself, rebuilt around the specific shape of his daughter's face in a doorway, the specific sound of a word he had heard 10,000 times and suddenly needed to keep hearing. He did not stop wearing the ring. He did not stop knowing things before he should know them. He did not undo what a century of influence had done to his valley or to his mind or to the people who had gathered around him and built their lives within his radius. But he began, for the first time, to fight. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been visible to anyone watching. Just the quiet, exhausting, daily work of a mind trying to distinguish between what it actually thought and what it had been taught to think, between what it actually wanted and what it had been shown to want, between the self it had been building for 6,000 years and the self that 100 years of wearing Sauron's instrument of dominion had been gradually, patiently, replacing. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was harder than the battles of the First Age, harder than the choice between elvenkind and mortality, harder than watching his brother die, harder than the fall of Eregion and the death of Gil-galad and the long grinding attrition of the War of the Last Alliance. It was harder because the enemy was not outside him. And it was not, he was beginning to understand, an enemy he could fight alone. He sent a letter to Galadriel. Not a messenger, a letter, handwritten, in a script so old that only a handful of beings in Middle-earth could still read it fluently, the angular characters of the First Age that predated the alphabets that Fina had later systematized and that Elrond had learned from his mother's people before the world had its current shape. He wrote it in that script deliberately, not for secrecy, anyone determined enough could find a scholar, but because the act of forming those particular characters required a kind of attention that the ring found difficult to infiltrate. The oldest habits were the deepest, and the deepest were the hardest to reach. He wrote, I have been wearing it. I have been wearing it for longer than I told you. I do not know with certainty where I end and where it begins, and I think this uncertainty is itself a symptom of the problem rather than an honest assessment of my condition. I am asking you to come. Not because I believe I cannot manage this alone, which is exactly the kind of thing it wants me to believe, but because the part of me that is still myself has concluded that wanting to manage this alone is also something it wants me to want. He sealed it with the device of his house rather than the ring of his office, which was a distinction that Galadriel would understand and a messenger would not. She arrived 6 weeks later. She came alone, without escort, which surprised him. Galadriel traveling without escort through the misty mountains in the early Third Age was not recklessness exactly, but it was a statement, and the statement was that she had read his letter carefully enough to understand that what was happening in Rivendell was not something she wanted witnessed by anyone who could later be questioned about it. She came into the valley at dusk, and Elrond met her at the gate himself, which he did not normally do for any visitor, and she looked at his face for a long moment before she said anything. You look tired, she said. I am tired, he said. In a way I have not been tired before. That is the most honest thing I have heard you say in a very long time. They walked. Rivendell in the evening had a quality that even now, even with everything that had changed, retained something of its original character, the light off the waterfalls, the particular quality of the air in the valley that had always felt slightly outside ordinary weather, slightly maintained, slightly more gentle than the world beyond its borders. Galadriel walked through it with the attention of someone conducting an assessment, feeling the texture of a place she had known for centuries and measuring how much it had changed. It is more beautiful than it was, she said. Yes. That is not a compliment. I know. They sat in the room he had described in his letter. She looked at the box on the shelf, plain wood, unremarkable, sitting among objects that were also unremarkable and had been arranged around it in a way that was clearly intentional, clearly a strategy for making the extraordinary look ordinary. She did not move toward it. She kept her hands in her lap and Nenya on her finger and her face in the careful neutrality of someone who is feeling a great deal and has decided that feeling it visibly would not be useful. How often? She asked. He told her the truth. The full truth, numbers and duration and the specific quality of what happened each time. The way it had changed over a century from something that felt like putting on a garment to something that felt more like remembering a language he had always known, to something that now felt, on the days he did not wear it, like an absence. Galadriel was quiet for a long time. You used the word absence, she said. Yes. Not withdrawal. Not deprivation. Absence. I understand the distinction you are drawing. I want to be certain you do, she said. Withdrawal implies that you know you are missing something harmful. Absence implies you experience it as a lag, as something that should be there, as normal. She looked at him steadily. Which is it? He thought about this with the genuine effort of a man trying to observe his own mind from a position outside it, which is one of the most difficult things any mind can attempt and becomes exponentially more difficult when the mind in question has been inhabited for a century by something designed to make its own presence feel natural. Both, he said finally. Depending on the day. Galadriel nodded. This seemed to satisfy something in her, not because it was good news, it was not, but because it was honest. An honesty from Elrond about this particular subject had become rare enough that its presence was itself meaningful. Then we do this carefully, she said. Not all at once. The ring has been part of your, she paused, choosing the word, your cognitive architecture for a century. Removing it abruptly could be as damaging as the wearing has been. We need to understand what is Elrond and what is the ring's influence before we can begin to separate them. And then destroy it, Elrond said. And then destroy it, she agreed. But I will not pretend the path between here and there is short. It was not short. What followed over the next several decades was the most methodical and painful process of self-examination that either of them had ever undertaken, and they undertook it together, Galadriel returning to Rivendell for weeks at a time, the two of them working through a system they developed themselves because nothing in the accumulated wisdom of Elvish scholarship addressed this specific problem. There was no precedent for an elf of Elrond's age and power and self-knowledge spending a century as the ring's bearer and then attempting to recover themselves. There was barely a precedent for surviving it. They developed what they called the method of distances. The principle was simple, the practice excruciating. Elrond would articulate a belief or a desire or an assessment of a situation, and Galadriel would ask him when he had first held it. If he had held it before the ring, it was more likely his own. If it had emerged or intensified after, it required examination. They were not always able to determine the answer. Many things fell into an ambiguous middle ground where a genuine belief had been amplified and distorted until it resembled itself only superficially, the way a melody played in the wrong key retains its notes but loses its character. The results were humbling. Some of what he had taken for wisdom turned out to be the ring's shaping, the conviction that he was uniquely suited to hold it, obviously, but also subtler things, the belief that Rivendell needed to be larger than it had historically been, the assessment that certain visitors were more trustworthy than others in ways that, when examined, correlated more with their usefulness to him than with any objective measure of their character. The slight but consistent preference he had developed for people who deferred to him over people who challenged him, which was so contrary to his natural temperament that it should have been immediately visible and had not been. Some things were genuinely his. The love for Arwen, clearly and entirely his, the ring had found it but could not have manufactured it. The grief for Celebrian. The commitment to the library, the accumulation of history, the fundamental conviction that memory was a form of resistance against the kind of darkness that won by making people forget what had been lost. This was his, 6,000 years old, predating the ring by more than any of its influence could reach. And Vilya. The ring of air. He had worn it for 1,000 years before he ever touched the One Ring, and its presence in him was so deep and so thoroughly integrated that separating its effects from his own character was essentially impossible. Galadriel observed this and said nothing for a long time, and when she did speak it was carefully. Vilya is not the One Ring, she said. But it is still a ring of power, and it was still made in the context of the One Ring's existence, and it is still an instrument that extends your will into the world. You understand this? I have always understood this, Elrond said. Understanding it and fully reckoning with what it means are not the same thing. He looked at her. Are you suggesting I should remove Vilya as well? I am suggesting that a full accounting of what you are requires honesty about all of it. Not only the most recent layer. This was the conversation that troubled him most. more than any of the others, because it pointed at something he was not ready to fully face, the possibility that the boundary between a ring of power used wisely and a ring of power using its bearer was not as clear as he had spent 1,000 years believing. That Vilya had been shaping him, gently, in ways he had not examined, long before the One Ring arrived. That the One Ring had found in him not a pristine self but a self already accustomed to the particular texture of carrying an instrument of power, already practiced in the rationalizations that such carrying required. He did not remove Vilya. He could not bring himself to, and Galadriel did not press it, and they both understood without saying so that this was itself a data point. What he did do, in the 40th year of this long and difficult work, was stop wearing the One Ring entirely. Not destroy it. Not yet. The question of destruction had become more complicated the longer they examined it, not because Elrond's rationalizations had been correct, but because Galadriel had developed her own concerns, separate from his, about what destruction might now mean. Sauron still existed in some diminished form. His wraith still moved in the world. The Nine Rings still exerted their pull on the men who had been given them, or on what those men had become. And there was a question that she had not been able to resolve, that kept her awake in the long nights of Lothlorien. Whether destroying the One Ring while Sauron was diminished but not gone would free him from the constraint of needing to reclaim it, allowing him to re-embody himself in some new form unbounded by his original design. The question was not rhetorical. The answer mattered. And they did not have it. So Elrond stopped wearing it and locked the box and gave the key to Galadriel and asked her to take it to Lothlorien, to keep it there where he could not easily retrieve it, to put enough distance between himself and it that the absence he felt would have time, over years and decades, to become something other than absence. She took it. She rode north out of Rivendell in the early spring of the 241st year of the Third Age, and Elrond watched her go from the same gate where he had once watched Celebrian ride toward the sea, and he felt the distance between himself and the box in her still back growing with each step of her horse like a thread being slowly pulled from his chest. He went back inside. He sat in the room that had held the box and was now just a room. He sat there for a long time. Then he went to find Arwen. She was in the garden, as she often was in the early morning, sitting with a book she was not reading, her face turned toward the light in the way she had that always reminded him of her mother and her grandmother simultaneously, the quality of attention both of them had brought to the world that she had somehow inherited from both sides at once. She looked up when she heard him coming. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch it, carefully, looking for the thing beneath the expression. "You gave it away," she said. He stopped. "How do you know about it, Ada?" Her voice was gentle but not gentle in the way of someone being careful. Gentle in the way of someone who has known a truth for a long time and has been waiting with patience for the right moment to say it. "I have lived in this valley for 2 centuries. I know every room in it. I have known about that box since I was a child." She paused. "I did not know what was in it. I think I did not want to know. But I knew it was important and I knew it was wrong and I knew that whatever it was why you sometimes looked like yourself and sometimes looked like someone wearing yourself." Elrond sat down beside her. The morning light came through the trees at the angle it always came through the trees at this time of year, the angle that had been constant since he first built this valley, unchanged through 3,000 years of everything else changing. "I am sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "I am going to spend a long time being less than I should be while I try to remember what I was." "I know that too," she said. "I will be here." He believed her. He had, perhaps for the first time in 2 centuries, no instrument for knowing things before they happened, and so he believed her the way an ordinary person believes something, with hope and uncertainty and the particular vulnerability of a mind that is learning, slowly and painfully, how to be without armor. It was, he thought, the most himself he had felt in a very long time. The ring sat in Lothlorien for 60 years before it began to work on Galadriel. She had known it would. This is the thing that distinguished her from Elrond at the mountain. She had no illusions about her own immunity, had in fact spent the intervening decades constructing elaborate internal defenses precisely because she understood that the ring's method was not assault but seduction, and that seduction worked most effectively on people who believed themselves prepared for it. She had watched what it did to Elrond. She had spent 40 years helping him map the damage. She knew exactly how it operated. And still, it began with Nenya. This was its first point of entry, its most natural leverage, the Ring of Water, the Ring of Adamant, the instrument through which Galadriel had maintained Lothlorien for 3,000 years, keeping it outside ordinary time, filling it with a light that belonged to an earlier age of the world. Nenya and the One Ring were not the same kind of object. but they were made in the same era by minds that had studied each other, and the One Ring had been designed by its maker with the three always in view, always as the ultimate target. There was a resonance between them that Galadriel had felt for 3,000 years as a distant hum, easy to ignore, easy to categorize as simply the ambient presence of a powerful object nearby. With the One Ring in Lothlorien, the hum became something else. It became a conversation. So quiet at first that she was not certain she was hearing it, not certain the distinction she was perceiving was real rather than imagined. But over weeks and months it became undeniable, a quality of communication between the two rings, a low-frequency exchange that happened below the level of conscious thought, in the part of her mind where Nenya had always lived, the part she did not examine closely because it had always simply worked, and examining closely the things that simply work is one of the disciplines that even the wisest minds find easy to neglect. She examined it now. What she found was that the One Ring was not speaking to her in words or images or even desires, the way it had worked on Elrond. It was working through Nenya. It was finding the places where Nenya's influence on her was deepest and oldest and most thoroughly integrated, and it was using those places as channels. It was working with her existing architecture rather than against it, which was more sophisticated than anything Elrond had described, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just realized that the enemy has been inside the walls longer than she thought, that this was because the ring had learned. A century with Elrond had taught it something about how an elven mind of great age and self-knowledge defended itself, and it had adjusted its approach accordingly. She moved the box to a chamber deep in the heart of Kara's Galadan, wrapped in wards she had been developing since before the War of the Last Alliance, sealed with techniques that combined the preservative power of Nenya with the older methods she had learned in Valinor before the darkening of the trees. She increased the distance between herself and it, physically, sleeping and working in the highest terrain of the Malorn trees while the box sat far below in stone. This helped. It did not solve the problem, because the problem was not proximity. The problem was that she had accepted the object into her domain, and her domain was an extension of herself, and there was no part of Lothlorien that was truly separate from her in the way that would have been necessary to make distance meaningful. She wrote to Elrond, "I understand now what you meant about architecture. I also understand that I am better prepared than you were, which is not the same as being safe. I am not asking for help. I am telling you this because you have earned the right to know, and because if something changes you should not be surprised." He wrote back within a fortnight, which was unusually fast for Elrond in those years when he was still doing the slow work of recovering himself. "I spent 100 years believing I was better prepared than any situation required. I offer this not as warning but as information." She appreciated the precision of the distinction. Information, not warning. He was learning to communicate in ways that did not assume he knew what she needed, which was itself evidence of recovery. What she did with the information was this: she called a council. Not the White Council, which did not yet formally exist, but something smaller and more private, herself and Elrond and the two Istari who had arrived in Middle-earth in the first millennium of the Third Age, Mithrandir and Curanir, known in the common tongue as Gandalf and Saruman. She did not tell them what the council was about before they came. She told them only that it was urgent and that their presence was necessary and that she would explain when they arrived. They came. Saruman arrived first, traveling from the south with the efficiency that characterized everything he did, his white robes immaculate in a way that suggested effort rather than ease, his face arranged in the expression he had developed over centuries of dealing with other powerful beings, interested, attentive, slightly superior in a way that was probably not intentional but had become habitual enough that it no longer mattered whether it was intentional. He was the head of the Istari order, appointed by the Valar themselves, and he carried this appointment with the awareness of someone who has been told they are the most important person in a room and has decided to believe it. Mithrandir arrived 3 days later, appearing at the border of Lothlorien with Shadowfax, or rather, with the horse he was riding then, Shadowfax being still unborn, and no announcement, in the way he had of simply being somewhere without having visibly traveled there. He came into the Golden Wood with the look he always had, which was simultaneously the look of someone who knew more than he was saying and the look of someone who found this knowledge less comforting than outside observers tended to assume. Elrond came from the east, quieter than either of them, and when he arrived Galadriel watched his face as he came through the border of Lothlorien and felt the ambient presence of the One Ring for the first time in 60 years. She watched for what she had learned to watch for, the slight relaxation, the thing that happened to the faces of people who had carried the ring when they came back into its proximity, the way a man who has been cold for a long time looks when he steps near a fire. She saw it. Brief, controlled, suppressed almost before it fully formed. But there. Elrond saw her watching and said nothing. They understood each other. She gathered them in a chamber with no windows, which was unusual for Lothlorien, where light was a principle rather than a feature. She set the box on a table in the center of the room. She did not open it. "The One Ring survived the War of the Last Alliance," she said. "It has been in my keeping for 60 years. This council exists to decide what to do with it." The silence that followed had different qualities in different parts of the room. Saruman's silence was the silence of someone recalibrating rapidly, reassessing everything he had been told about the events of the Second Age's end, understanding that a foundational assumption had been wrong and already beginning to construct a new architecture on the corrected foundation. Mithrandir's silence was harder to read, it always was, but Galadriel had known him long enough to recognize the particular stillness that came over him when he was not surprised by a revelation but was surprised by the specific form it had taken. "Who took it?" Saruman said. His voice was careful in the way that careful voices are when the speaker is controlling something. Galadriel looked at Elrond. Elrond said, "I did." Another silence. Saruman looked at him with an expression that moved through several phases quickly: shock, assessment, calculation, and then something that settled into a kind of intense interest that Galadriel did not entirely like the quality of. "And you held it for over a century," Elrond said. "I no longer hold it. I gave it to Galadriel 60 years ago when I had recovered enough judgment to recognize that I should not have it." "Recovered," Saruman said. The word landed with the precise weight of a man who files information for future use. Mithrandir had not spoken. He was looking at the box on the table with an expression that was not quite recognizable as any of the emotions his face usually organized itself into. When he finally spoke, he did not address the question of who had held it or for how long. "It needs to be destroyed," he said. "Yes," Galadriel said. "Then why hasn't it been?" "Because the question of what destruction means in this case is not settled," Galadriel said. "Sauron was not destroyed at the end of the Second Age. He was diminished. He exists in some form. The ring was made as an extension of him, the largest, most fundamental extension of his will and his being that he ever attempted. If we destroy the ring while he still has some form of existence, we do not know whether we unmake him or whether we simply sever him from his greatest instrument while leaving him free to begin again in a form we cannot anticipate. And if we keep it," Mithrandir said, "we have established that it cannot be kept safely." "Yes," Galadriel said. "Those are the only two options," Mithrandir said. "Keeping it is slow destruction. Destroying it is uncertain. We should choose the uncertainty over the certainty." Saruman had been quiet through this exchange in the way that a man is quiet when he is waiting for the moment to say the thing he has already decided to say. "There is a third option," he said. Everyone in the room looked at him. "Study it," Saruman said. "Not wear it. Not keep it in the way it has been kept, with all the ambiguity that keeping implies. Systematic study, apply to it the same methods we would apply to any powerful artifact, understand its structure, understand how it was made, understand what makes it possible for it to do what it does. If we understand it well enough, we can destroy it in a way that is not uncertain. We can know what we are doing and what the consequences will be before we do it." "You are describing exactly the rationalization that Elrond used for 100 years, Mithrandir said. "Not unkindly. Simply as a fact." "I am describing something different," Saruman said. "Elrond wore it. I am proposing that no one wear it. That it be studied from the outside, kept in conditions of maximum containment, examined by minds that have been explicitly warned against the specific methods it uses, with regular oversight from all of us to ensure that no single person becomes its primary handler. It will adapt," Galadriel said. "Whatever method you describe to it, it will find the edges of that method." "Perhaps," Saruman said. "Or perhaps the accumulated knowledge of the 5 Istari and the 2 greatest elvish minds in Middle-earth is sufficient to contain it long enough to understand it. We should not assume failure before we have attempted the task." Mithrandir looked at Galadriel. Galadriel looked at Elrond. Elrond looked at the box on the table. "No," Elrond said. Quietly. With the finality of someone who has lived inside the argument Saruman was making and knows exactly where it leads. "No study. No containment. No managed relationship with it. That is what I told myself for 100 years and every word of it was true and none of it was the truth. The only thing to do with it is destroy it, and the only question worth answering is how to do that without consequences we cannot survive." Saruman looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has had a door closed in his face and is already looking for a window. "Then we need to find Sauron," Mithrandir said. "Find him, understand what he is now, and determine whether his destruction is possible before we destroy the ring, or whether the two must happen simultaneously." "That could take decades," Saruman said. Yes, Mithrandir said. It probably will. Galadriel looked around the room, at Saruman's controlled face, at Mithrandir's complicated eyes, at Elrond's exhausted certainty, and felt the weight of what they had not said as clearly as what they had. They had agreed on nothing except the shape of the problem. They had not agreed on the solution. They had not agreed on the timeline. And in the chamber below them, in its plain wooden box, the ring was listening to all of it with the patient intelligence of something that had all the time in the world and knew that time, in sufficient quantities, was the only weapon it needed. She called the council ended. She told them to return in 10 years. She sat alone after they left, in the windowless room with the box, and she thought about what Saruman had said, not the argument he had made, but the quality of the interest underneath it. The particular intensity when he looked at the box. The way he had filed away every detail of what Elrond had described. She thought, he is already thinking about it. Not wearing it. Not yet. But thinking about it the way you think about something you have decided you will eventually do. She thought, we do not have 10 years. She was right. They did not have 10 years. What they had was 4, and then Saruman came back alone. He did not announce himself. He arrived at the border of Lothlorien in the deep of winter, the 3rd winter after the council, and the wardens who met him there said afterward that he had the look of someone who had been traveling for a long time and did not want to talk about where he had been. He was still wearing white. His robes were immaculate in the way they always were, which was itself a kind of statement, that whatever he had been doing, it had not touched him, or he had not permitted it to touch him, or he had gone to significant effort to ensure that he did not appear touched. Galadriel received him in the open air rather than inside, which was a choice he noticed and did not comment on. The golden wood in winter had a different quality than the golden wood in other seasons. The malorn leaves had fallen, which they did not do in ordinary years, and the branches were bare in a way that made the wood feel larger and more exposed than it did when it was in full light. She had chosen the location deliberately. She wanted him uncomfortable. She wanted the conversation to happen in a space where nothing was contained. You have been to Dol Guldur, she said, before he spoke. He looked at her. You knew. I suspected. Now I know. She studied his face with the attention she had developed over 15,000 years of reading people who were trying not to be read. What did you find? Not Sauron, Saruman said. Or, not definitively. Something is there. Something with sufficient will and intention to have rebuilt the fortress to a functional state, to have gathered servants, to be operating with a degree of coordination that suggests a directing intelligence. Whether that intelligence is Sauron in a new form or a lieutenant acting independently or something else entirely, he paused. I could not determine it. I did not stay long enough to determine it. Why not? A brief silence. Because I became uncertain whether remaining was wise. This was, from Saruman, an extraordinary admission. Galadriel filed it carefully. Describe the uncertainty, she said. It is difficult to describe precisely, he said, which from Saruman meant it was possible to describe precisely, but the precise description was not something he wanted to give her. She waited. He looked at the bare branches above them and then back at her face and made the calculation she had been watching him make since he arrived, how much to tell her, where the line was between what she needed to know and what he preferred to keep. There is something in that place that knows about the ring, he said finally. Not that we have it. Or, he stopped. Started again. I cannot be certain what it knows. But there is an awareness there that is oriented toward the ring's existence in a way that suggests it has not accepted the assumption that the ring was lost at the Gladden Fields with Isildur. It is looking. Not in a specific direction, it does not know where to look. But it is looking. Galadriel was quiet for a moment. Around them the winter wood was silent in the way that Lothlorien was never quite silent anywhere else, a silence that had texture, that was maintained rather than simply present. It will find us eventually, she said. Yes. Then the question of timing has changed. Yes, he said. I believe it has. She sent a message to Elrond that night. She sent another to Mithrandir, who was somewhere in the Shire. He had developed an inexplicable fondness for hobbits over the past several centuries and spent more time among them than anyone else in his order thought was particularly dignified, which Galadriel had always privately considered one of his better qualities. The messages said only, come. Sooner than planned. Elrond arrived within the month. Mithrandir took somewhat longer, which was characteristic. He traveled on his own schedule and no message, however urgent, fully overrode his sense of what the moment required. When he arrived he smelled of pipeweed and river water and the particular outdoors quality of someone who had been sleeping under the sky, and he looked at Galadriel and then at Saruman with the expression he wore when he was assembling a picture from pieces that he already mostly had. Dol Guldur, he said to Saruman. Yes, Saruman said. I have been watching it for 3 years, Mithrandir said. From a distance. I wanted to be certain of what I was seeing before I said anything. He sat down on a root that was approximately the right height for sitting on, as if he had known it would be there. It is Sauron. Not his full form, he is not capable of full manifestation yet, perhaps not for a very long time. But it is him. The signature is unmistakable to anyone who felt it in the Second Age. He looked at Galadriel. You felt it then? I felt it, she said. Then you will recognize what I mean when I say that what is in Dol Guldur has the same quality. Diminished. Distorted. Pressed into a shape smaller than its original nature. But recognizably the same. Saruman had gone very still in the way he went still when information arrived that required rapid reorganization of existing frameworks. You have been watching for 3 years and said nothing to this council. I was not certain, Mithrandir said. Now I am. The distinction matters less than you seem to think, Saruman said. 3 years of observation that was not shared. Saruman. Galadriel's voice was not loud. It did not need to be. We are not here to adjudicate process. We are here to decide what to do. What to do. The phrase sat in the winter air between 4 of the most powerful minds in Middle-earth, and none of them immediately filled the silence it left, because the answer was obvious, and the obvious answer was the one none of them had yet found a way to execute. Destroy the ring. Find a way to do it that did not leave Sauron free to reconstitute himself in a new form, unconstrained by his previous design, unbound by the specific vulnerabilities that his long investment in the ring had created in him. Understand the relationship between his current diminished state and the ring's existence well enough to know whether destroying one destroyed the other, or whether the two things needed to happen simultaneously, or whether there was some sequence that minimized the risk. The problem was that understanding this required knowledge they did not have. And acquiring the knowledge required either studying the ring, which Elrond had refused and Galadriel had come to agree with him on, or studying Sauron directly, which meant someone going to Dol Guldur with the specific intention of learning rather than fleeing, which was precisely the kind of mission that sounded more reasonable the further you were from Dol Guldur and less reasonable the closer you got. I will go, Mithrandir said. Everyone looked at him. Not to confront him, he said. Not yet. To observe. To understand what he has become and what relationship that bears to the ring. I have been watching from the outside. I need to get closer. Close enough to feel the specific quality of his awareness, close enough to understand whether destroying the ring would unmake him or free him. That is extraordinarily dangerous, Elrond said. Yes, Mithrandir agreed pleasantly. You could be captured. You could be. I am aware of the risks involved in walking into the fortress of a Dark Lord, Mithrandir said. I have been aware of them for some time. I am also aware that we have had the ring for 300 years and are no closer to a resolution than we were when Galadriel took it from Elrond, and that Sauron is not diminishing, he is growing, slowly, and the longer we wait the less favorable the conditions for whatever we eventually decide to do. Saruman said nothing. He had the look of a man watching a situation develop and deciding where to position himself relative to it. And if you are captured? Galadriel asked. Then the council will need to act without the information I would have brought back, which is the same position you are in now. He looked at her steadily. But I do not intend to be captured. No one intends to be captured, Elrond said. No, Mithrandir agreed. But intention and outcome correlate more strongly than pessimism would suggest. He looked around at all of them, Galadriel with her careful assessment, Elrond with his exhausted certainty, Saruman with his still face and his filing away eyes. Is there an alternative proposal? There was not. They all knew there was not. The silence that followed was the silence of people who have been circling a necessary thing for a long time and have finally run out of circles. Go carefully, Galadriel said. Always, he said. He left Lothlorien 2 days later, traveling east toward Mirkwood, toward Dol Guldur, toward the diminished and patient darkness that was waiting at the center of that corrupted forest, with the particular quality of waiting that belongs to things that have lost almost everything and are building themselves back up from the foundations with the slow, terrible patience of something that knows it has already survived being destroyed once. The remaining 3 sat with the box between them and discussed logistics, where the ring would be moved, whether additional wards were necessary, what the protocol would be if Mithrandir did not return within a specified time. Saruman contributed to this discussion with precision and apparent engagement, and Galadriel watched his face throughout and said less than she was thinking, and Elrond watched Galadriel watching Saruman and understood what she was not saying. Afterward, when Saruman had gone to the guest quarters that had been prepared for him, Elrond sat with Galadriel in the chamber she used for private counsel, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that people who have known each other for a very long time are sometimes quiet, not the silence of people with nothing to say but the silence of people deciding which of the many things they have to say is the most necessary. He wants it, Elrond said. Yes, Galadriel said. He has wanted it since the first council. Yes. And he is not yet compromised. Not the way I was. But he is thinking about it in a way that is already not innocent. The thinking is never innocent, Galadriel said. That is what took me so long to understand. The ring does not wait until you touch it. It begins with the thinking. The wondering. The very reasonable question of what you could do with it if you had it, held only theoretically, examined only as a thought experiment. She looked at her own hands, at Nenya on her finger, at the object she had carried for 3,000 years and was no longer certain she understood fully. Saruman has been asking that question since the first council. Every year the question has more detail in it. More specificity. More conviction. What do? We watch him, she said. The same way he has been watching Dol Guldur. From close enough to observe. Far enough to not be observed observing. Elrond was quiet for a moment. And if Mithrandir does not come back? The question sat between them. Then we do not wait for the next council, Galadriel said. We act. Whatever acting means at that point, whatever information we have, whatever certainty we can achieve, we act. Because waiting has a cost that keeps compounding, and we have been paying it for 300 years, and there is a point at which the interest exceeds what we can afford. She looked at the wall behind which the box was kept, feeling as she always felt its ambient presence, the low hum of something immensely powerful contained in something deliberately unremarkable. 3 centuries. 3 centuries since the mountain, since the ash and the dying light and the warm circle of gold in a tired half-elf's palm. 3 centuries of good intentions and careful management and methodical examination, and the most sophisticated minds in Middle-earth all pointed at the same problem, and none of them, had yet managed to do the one thing that had been obvious from the first moment. Outside, in the winter dark of Lothlorien, a wizard was saddling a horse for a journey he might not return from. Inside, in the silence, 2 of the oldest living minds in Middle-earth sat with a god's discarded instrument between them and admitted to themselves what they had not quite admitted before. They were afraid. Not of Sauron. Not of the ring. Of themselves, of what 3 more centuries of this might do to even the best of intentions, of how much longer the architecture of their resistance could hold, of what they would be willing to tell themselves was necessary if the waiting went on long enough. Fear, Galadriel thought, was useful. Fear meant you still understood the stakes. The moment you stopped being afraid was the moment you had already lost something essential. She held onto the fear carefully, the way you hold something fragile, and she did not let herself think about what it would feel like to not be afraid anymore. Mithrandir was gone for 11 years. Not missing, gone. There is a distinction, and it mattered to the council in different ways depending on who you asked. Elrond maintained that gone and missing were functionally identical from the perspective of those left behind, that the difference was only knowable in retrospect, and that planning around the assumption of return was the same category of error as planning around the assumption of loss. Galadriel held the distinction differently. She had felt, through means she could not fully explain and did not try to, that Mithrandir was alive, not well, not safe, not unharmed, but alive in the specific sense of a consciousness still present in the world and still oriented toward its purpose. Saruman said nothing about the distinction. He had stopped talking about Mithrandir after the 3rd year. The 11 years were not quiet years. Sauron, the thing in Dol Guldur that they had agreed to call Sauron while privately holding varying degrees of certainty about whether the name was accurate, had not been idle. Mirkwood had continued its long darkening, the process that had been underway since before anyone on the council had been paying close attention, the slow corruption of a forest that had once been called Greenwood the Great and was becoming something that justified its new name more thoroughly with each passing decade. Spiders moved through it in numbers that suggested coordinated purpose rather than natural proliferation. The wood elves under Thranduil were being pressed toward the north, their territory contracting, their border skirmishes increasing in frequency. Travelers through the forest reported losing their sense of direction in ways that went beyond ordinary disorientation, finding themselves turned around in clearings they did not recognize, hearing sounds that did not correspond to any creature they knew. The darkness was organizing itself. This was the significant development, the thing that distinguished this decade from the previous centuries of Sauron's diminished existence, not the darkness itself, which had always been there in some form, but the quality of intention behind it. Something was directing it. Something was using it as an instrument rather than simply generating it as a byproduct. Galadriel watched this from Lothlorien with the attention she brought to things that concerned her and the enforced patience of someone who had learned, over a very long life, that acting before you understood a situation completely was usually more expensive than waiting. But the waiting had a texture now that it had not had before. Attention. The sense of a system under increasing pressure whose tolerance for that pressure was finite and was being approached. In the 8th year of Mithrandir's absence, Saruman asked to examine the ring. He framed it carefully. He had been thinking, he said, about the question of simultaneous destruction, whether destroying the ring and ending Sauron needed to happen at the same time, and whether there was a way to understand the relationship between them that did not require direct contact with Sauron, but could be derived instead from a sufficiently thorough analysis of the ring itself. He was not proposing to wear it. He was not proposing to handle it more than was necessary for examination. He was proposing a structured study, conducted in Galadriel's presence, with explicit protocols designed to prevent the kind of gradual infiltration that had compromised Elrond. He had prepared documentation. He presented it to Galadriel and Elrond together, 30 pages of precisely reasoned argument in Saruman's immaculate hand, covering the methodology, the safeguards, the theoretical framework for what could be learned and how, the expected timeline, the criteria for stopping if anything concerning was observed. Elrond read it in its entirety. Then he put it down. "No," he said. Saruman looked at him with the expression of a man who has expected this response and prepared for it. "Your objection is the same objection I always have," Elrond said. "The documentation is impressive. The methodology is sound, on its own terms. The safeguards are exactly the safeguards I would have designed for myself, and I would have believed in them exactly as sincerely as you believe in these, and they would have failed in exactly the same ways for exactly the same reason." He looked at Saruman steadily. "The ring does not operate within the terms of any framework you build for it. It operates in the spaces between the terms. The more sophisticated the framework, the more sophisticated its method of finding the spaces." "You are arguing that it cannot be studied at all," Saruman said. "I am arguing that you cannot study it. That I cannot. That Galadriel cannot. That no mind in Middle-earth, however powerful, however prepared, however extensively warned, is sufficient to examine it from the outside while remaining genuinely outside it." He paused. "This is not an argument about intelligence or discipline or the quality of anyone's intentions. It is an argument about the nature of the object." Saruman turned to Galadriel. "And you agree?" "I agree," Galadriel said. He looked at them both for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated that he had not fully managed to suppress, not anger exactly, but the frustration of a man who has encountered a wall and cannot find the door and is beginning to wonder whether the people who built the wall are keeping the door from him deliberately. "We have had this object for over 300 years, he said. "We are no closer to resolving the question of how to destroy it safely than we were when you took it from Elrond. Sauron is growing. We are waiting for Mithrandir to return with information that may never come. And your answer to all of this is continued inaction." "My answer," Galadriel said, "is continued caution. They are not the same thing. In practice," Saruman said, "they are producing the same results." This was true, and the fact that it was true and that all three of them knew it was true made the silence that followed particularly heavy. Galadriel sat with it rather than trying to resolve it, because some truths were better held for a moment than immediately deflected, and this was one of them. "Give us until Mithrandir returns," she said finally. "If he returns with information that changes the calculus, we act on that information. If he does not return," she paused. "If he does not return, we revisit everything." Saruman looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the quality of someone filing away the terms of an agreement he intends to reference later. Mithrandir returned 3 years after that conversation, in the 341st year of the Third Age, arriving at the borders of Lothlorien without announcement and without Shadowfax, who had apparently departed his company somewhere in Mirkwood on a matter of his own business. He was thinner than when he had left, which was not something that should have been possible for an Istar, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, not trauma exactly, but the quality of a mind that has seen something it is still in the process of integrating. Galadriel met him at the border herself. She looked at his face for a long moment. He looked back at her without the usual layering of his expression, without the habitual half-concealment that characterized his normal manner. He was, for once, simply present, tired and old and present. "You were inside," she said. "For a time," he said. "How long?" "I am not entirely certain." "Time in that place," he made a gesture that encompassed the inadequacy of language for what he was trying to describe. It does not behave consistently. She brought him inside, fed him, gave him rest, and did not ask anything further until he indicated he was ready. This took 4 days, which told her something about what those 11 years had cost him even before he began to speak. When he spoke for a very long time. He described Dol Guldur as he had experienced it from proximity over 11 years of careful, patient observation conducted from positions of increasing closeness and increasing danger, the architecture of the darkness there, the specific quality of the intelligence directing it, the way it moved and reached and organized and waited. He described the moment he had understood that Sauron knew he was being watched, that the observation had become mutual, that 11 years of watching had also been 11 years of being watching. And he described what he had understood about the ring. This was the part that mattered. This was what they had been waiting for, the information that no amount of study from outside could have provided, that required exactly what Mithrandir had done, a mind willing to go close enough to genuine darkness to feel its specific nature rather than only observe its effects. The ring and Sauron are not the same thing, he said. But they are not separable in the way we had hoped. What he poured into it, it is not a metaphor, the pouring. He genuinely transferred something of his fundamental nature into it. Not a copy. Not a reflection. A portion. The ring is not a tool he made. It is a part of him he exteriorized. He looked at Galadriel. Destroying the ring will diminish him. It will not destroy him. Not in his current state. He is too far recovered. He has rebuilt enough of himself, slowly, without the ring, that the portion he invested in it is no longer the majority of what he is. Then destroying the ring simply accelerates the situation we are already in, Elrond said. He had arrived the previous day, summoned by a message from Galadriel that had said only, "He is back." Not accelerates, Mithrandir said. Changes. Destroying the ring removes his ability to dominate other ring bearers, removes his strongest instrument of will extension, reduces him, significantly. But does not end him. He will still be in Dol Guldur, or somewhere like it, growing. So we destroy the ring and then we deal with Sauron, Saruman said. He had said very little since Mithrandir's return. He had been listening with an attention so focused it had a physical quality. Yes, Mithrandir said. In that sequence. The ring first, because the ring is the more immediate danger, not from Sauron's recovering it, which he is not yet capable of, but from what it continues to do to whoever holds it. He looked at Galadriel with something that was not quite an apology and not quite an accusation. 340 years is a very long time to be in proximity to it. Even for you. The room was quiet. Galadriel said, "When?" "Soon," Mithrandir said. "Within the year. Before Sauron recovers further, before the situation in Mirkwood deteriorates beyond the point where we can operate freely, before." He looked at the wall behind which the box was kept, and his expression did something she had not seen it do before, a brief unguarded thing. The look of a man who has spent 11 years in the shadow of an immense darkness and is only now, in relative safety, allowing himself to feel what that cost him. Before any more time passes. We have lost enough time. Saruman was looking at the same wall. His face was very still and very composed and revealed nothing at all. Galadriel looked at him looking at the wall and thought, he is not going to let this happen. She did not say this. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things that needed to be watched, the things that were not yet crises but had the shape of crises approaching, and she smiled at Mithrandir with genuine warmth and genuine relief, because he had come back and that was real and worth holding on to. Within the year, she said. Good. She began that same evening to plan for the possibility that within the year might not be soon enough. The box was gone 11 days after Mithrandir's return. Galadriel discovered it at dawn, in the way that absences make themselves known before you have fully registered what is missing, a quality of the air in the chamber, a change in the low ambient hum that she had spent 3.5 centuries learning to hear without hearing, a silence where there had always been, beneath everything, a kind of frequency. She stood in the doorway of the inner chamber and looked at the shelf where the plain wooden box had sat among plain unremarkable objects for 340 years and felt something that was colder than fear and more precise. She had expected something. She had not expected this, not the clean removal, not the absence of any disturbance, not the fact that every ward she had constructed around the chamber was intact and unbroken. Whatever had happened here had not happened from outside. It had happened from within her own defenses, which meant someone who knew the defenses completely, who had been inside Lothlorien long enough and with sufficient access to map every layer of protection she had built. Saruman had been a guest in Lothlorien for 3 weeks. She sent word to Mithrandir first, then to Elrond. She did not send word to Saruman, because Saruman was already gone, his rooms empty, his horse missing from the stables, the trail of his departure leading south and east in a direction that told her nothing definitive except that he had not gone toward the Grey Havens, had not gone toward Rivendell, had not gone toward any destination that suggested the intention of someone who had taken the ring in order to destroy it. Mithrandir came to her room within the hour, dressed as if he had not slept, which she suspected was accurate. "How long ago?" he said. "Sometime in the last 3 days," she said. "I cannot narrow it further." He was careful. Mithrandir sat down heavily in a way that she associated with him only when he was genuinely tired, not the performed weariness he sometimes used to make people underestimate him, but the real thing, the weight of 11 years of proximity to darkness plus 3 weeks of something she now understood had been worse than she had realized. "He came to me twice while I was recovering," Mithrandir said. "Conversations. He was asking me, I thought he was asking me about what I had observed, about Sauron's condition, about the nature of the ring's connection to him. I answered him. I answered him fully because I thought we were." He stopped. "I thought the council was still the council." He was mapping the destruction methodology, Galadriel said. "Understanding what we knew and what we didn't know, what the risks were and what the timeline was." "Yes," Mithrandir said. "And now he has what he needs to make a decision about it." "Which decision?" Mithrandir looked at her with eyes that had spent 11 years looking at things he had not expected to have to look at, and said something that she had been thinking but had not yet said aloud. "He is going to use it. Not study it. Not destroy it. Use it, try to use it, the way Elrond used it, but with more preparation and more self-awareness and the explicit intention of wielding it against Sauron rather than simply holding it." He paused. He has spent 300 years watching two people be compromised by it and becoming increasingly certain that what they lacked was sufficient discipline and a clear enough purpose. He believes he is different. "They all believe they are different," Galadriel said. "Yes," Mithrandir said. "They do." Elrond arrived 2 days later, and when Galadriel told him what had happened, his face did something she had not seen it do in a very long time. It went completely still in the particular way of someone absorbing information that confirms a fear they had been carefully not examining. He sat down. He was quiet for a long moment. "He listened to everything I said about what it does," Elrond said. "At every council. He asked good questions. Specific questions. About the progression, about the early stages, about the distinction between the ring's influence and my own judgment. I thought he was trying to understand in order to protect himself." He paused. "He was trying to understand in order to replicate the experience with better controls. He has the information," Mithrandir said. "He knows what it does in the early stages. He knows what to watch for. He believes that knowing what to watch for is sufficient to avoid the outcomes you experienced." "It is not sufficient," Elrond said. "No," Mithrandir said. "It is not. But we cannot tell him that from here." The question of what they could do from here was the question that the three of them circled for the next several days, in the way that people circle questions to which none of the available answers are good. They could follow Saruman, but they did not know where he had gone, and he had several days' head start, and he was not a man who could be easily followed when he chose not to be found. They could alert the other Istari, Radagast in the east, the two blue wizards in the far distant lands where no news ever came from, but the blue wizards had been effectively beyond contact for centuries, and Radagast's usefulness in this specific kind of situation was limited by his particular orientation toward the natural world rather than the political one. They could go to Isengard, Saruman's seat in the south, but Saruman had not gone to Isengard, his trail had indicated otherwise, and Isengard without Saruman told them nothing about Saruman with the ring. What they could not do was do nothing. This was the clearest thing, the one point of complete agreement, that the situation as it now stood was precisely the worst version of every outcome they had been trying to prevent for 3.5 centuries. The ring was not destroyed. It was not even contained. It was in the hands of a man who was brilliant and disciplined and whose orientation toward power had been developing for 1,000 years in a direction that none of them had examined closely enough until it was too late to examine closely enough. On the 5th day, Mithrandir said, "I know where he has gone." They looked at him. "Not Isengard," he said. "Not yet. He has gone to Mirkwood. To Dol Guldur." He saw their expressions and continued before either of them could speak. "He has gone to confront Sauron. Directly. While he still believes himself in control of the ring, before the ring has had time to work on him in the ways he has been warned about, while the purpose is still clear in his mind, remove Sauron, solve the problem, prove that the ring can be wielded against its maker." The silence that followed had the quality of an intake of breath. "He is going to fail," Elrond said. "Yes," Mithrandir said. "In one of two ways. Either Sauron is stronger than Saruman anticipates and the confrontation goes badly, in which case Sauron recovers the ring and everything becomes immeasurably worse. Or Saruman is stronger than Sauron in his current diminished state and wins the confrontation, drives him out of Dol Guldur, scatters his servants, appears to have succeeded, and returns believing the ring can be wielded, believing himself proven right, and we lose him permanently to exactly the conviction we have been trying to prevent. 2 failures, Galadriel said. 1 catastrophic immediately. 1 catastrophic over time. Yes. Then we go after him, Elrond said. Not to fight him. To be there. To be present when it happens, whatever it is, so that we can. So that we can what? Mithrandir said. Not unkindly. With the directness of someone who has done 11 years of hard thinking about the limits of what can be done. Take the ring from him by force? We could not take it from you when you had it. We could not take it from Galadriel when she held it. We were able to address those situations through persuasion and time because the bearers retained enough of themselves to eventually cooperate with their own recovery. Saruman has gone to Dol Guldur. He has gone on purpose. He is not going to cooperate with anything we propose for a very long time, if ever. Then what do we do? Elrond said. The question was quieter than his previous ones. It had lost the quality of a problem to be solved and gained the quality of a genuine question, a man asking because he did not know rather than asking to structure an argument toward a conclusion he had already reached. Mithrandir was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the quality of the silence changed from waiting to something more like sitting with the reality of what they were in, fully, without flinching from any part of it. We go to Dol Guldur, he said finally. Not after Saruman. For our own reasons. Because Mirkwood cannot continue to darken and the Wood Elves cannot continue to be pressed north and the shadow cannot continue to grow without consequence, and those things are true regardless of what Saruman does or does not do with the ring. We go because it is time to go, because we have been waiting for 3 centuries and the waiting is over, because whatever happens there is better than what is happening here. He looked at Galadriel. And we go because if there is any possibility of being present at the moment when Saruman understands that he was wrong, if there is any chance of being there to receive that understanding and respond to it before it becomes something else, we have to be there. Galadriel looked at him for a long time. At the face that had spent 11 years in proximity to genuine darkness and come back with its essential nature intact, which she had considered impossible before it happened and now considered only the most extraordinary thing she had witnessed in 15,000 years. When, she said. Spring, he said. We gather what forces we can, the Wood Elves, Gondor if they will come, whatever allies remain. We make it a council action rather than 3 individuals pursuing a missing Istar. We make it as large and as official and as visible as possible, because whatever is in Dol Guldur responds to power and the appearance of power and we should not arrive looking like a search party. Elrond was nodding slowly. And the ring? The ring will be wherever Saruman is, Mithrandir said. Which means dealing with the ring means dealing with Saruman, and dealing with Saruman means dealing with everything he has become since he left here, and we do not yet know what that is. He looked at his hands, the old weathered hands of a wandering wizard, the hands of a Maya who had taken on mortality's texture voluntarily and had spent 1,000 years becoming genuinely fond of it. We address what we can address and we trust that the rest will reveal itself when we are close enough to see it clearly. It was not a satisfying answer. None of the answers available to them were satisfying. Galadriel had spent 15,000 years dealing with unsatisfying answers to urgent questions and had developed a relationship with that particular form of difficulty that was not quite acceptance and not quite resignation but something more functional than either, the understanding that the distance between what you knew and what you needed to know was itself the condition of action, not an obstacle to it. You moved in the direction of greater knowledge and you made decisions from whatever position you occupied when decisions became unavoidable. She stood. I will write to Thranduil, she said. Mithrandir, the southern forces are your task, Gondor's steward and whatever of the northern Dunedain can be reached. Elrond looked at her. Go home, she said. Not unkindly. Rest. Prepare. Bring whoever from Rivendell you think should come. She paused. And bring Vilya. Whatever we find in Dol Guldur, we will want everything we have. He left the next morning. She stood at the border and watched him go the way she had watched people go her entire long life, with the attention of someone who does not assume that every departure is temporary, who has lived long enough to know that some farewells announce themselves as farewells and others do not, and that the ones that do not are the ones you carry longest. Then she went back inside and began writing letters and making calculations and doing the slow grinding practical work of turning a decision into a plan, which was less dramatic than the decision but was ultimately what determined whether the decision was real or only an intention. Spring was coming. Dol Guldur was waiting. Saruman was somewhere between here and there with the ring in his possession and a purpose in his mind that had been building for 3 centuries and would not be argued out of him and could not be taken from him by force and would have to be, somehow, through means she had not yet identified, met on its own terms. She wrote. Outside, the Malorn trees were bare against a winter sky. She thought about Saruman arriving at Dol Guldur. About what he would feel the moment he came into proximity with Sauron wearing the One Ring. About whether the ring would pull toward its maker or whether it would resist, recognize in Saruman a bearer with sufficient will to hold it against the pull, and what that resistance would feel like to a man who had spent 3 centuries convincing himself that the right person with the right preparation could hold anything. She thought about what Sauron would feel. The ring, returning. Not in Saruman's possession, in Saruman's belief. 2 very different things. She wrote faster. Spring came to Mirkwood the way spring came to all corrupted places, partially, reluctantly, with the quality of light that arrives through dirty glass, present but diminished, the warmth real but somehow unable to fully assert itself against the cold that had been accumulating in the forest's bones for centuries. The trees that had once been part of Greenwood the Great stood in their new configurations, trunks darkened, canopy dense in the wrong way, the undergrowth tangled with the specific malevolence of things that grow in the absence of care rather than the presence of it. The host that rode toward Dol Guldur was smaller than any of them had wanted and larger than any of them had expected, which was the usual arithmetic of coalition building in the Third Age. Thranduil had sent 300 woodland archers, which was significant given the pressure his borders were already under and which Galadriel understood was as much a statement about Thranduil's pride as it was about his military judgment. He was not going to be seen as the elf king who stood aside while others dealt with the darkness growing in his own forest. A company from Gondor had come north at Mithrandir's request, 400 soldiers under a captain named Calamorn who had the look of a man who had been told what they were marching toward and had decided that knowing made no practical difference to the marching. Elrond had brought 80 from Rivendell, which was almost everyone he could spare, which was itself a measure of how seriously he was treating this. Galadriel rode with a guard of 50 from Lothlorien. She wore Nenya openly for the first time in decades, not as a display, but as a tool, because what they were riding toward was going to require everything available and concealment was a luxury that had expired. Mithrandir rode beside her on a grey horse whose name she did not know. He had been quiet since they entered Mirkwood, the specific quiet of a man re-encountering something he had spent 11 years trying to leave behind. She watched him from the corner of her attention and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say and Mithrandir had never required words to feel accompanied. They found Saruman 3 miles from Dol Guldur. Not inside it, outside, on the road that led through the last stretch of corrupted forest to the fortress's outer gates, sitting on a fallen log with his white robes dark with ash and his staff across his knees and an expression on his face that was the most unguarded thing Galadriel had ever seen on him. He looked like a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found something so completely different that his entire architecture of expectation had simply stopped, had ceased to function, had left him sitting in the ruins of itself, not distressed exactly, not broken, but profoundly and completely still in the way of someone whose usual motion has been interrupted by an encounter with something larger than motion. He looked up when he heard them coming. He looked at Mithrandir first, then at Galadriel, then at the host behind them, and something in his face shifted, not relief, not shame, something more complex and less nameable than either of those things. He was not wearing the ring. Galadriel saw this immediately, the absence of it on his fingers, the closed quality of his left hand that suggested it was elsewhere on his person but not deployed, not active, not doing what he had come here to make it do. This told her something important before he said a single word. "You came," he said. "Yes," Mithrandir said. He dismounted, with the unhurried quality of a man who has been on a horse for several days and is glad to be off it, and walked toward Saruman and sat down on the same fallen log with a few feet of space between them, as if this were a conversation they had arranged in advance rather than a meeting that had found its own shape. What happened? Saruman was quiet for a moment. He looked at his closed left hand, then opened it. The ring lay in his palm, warm, gold, unremarkable in appearance, deeply remarkable in the specific quality of attention it seemed to generate in everyone who saw it, the way the eye went to it and stayed there with a pull that was not magnetism but functioned like it. He closed his hand again. "I wore it," he said, "once. For perhaps an hour, before I reached the fortress. He said it with the precision of a man giving testimony against himself, neither minimizing nor embellishing. I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was bringing to the confrontation. I wanted to feel the extent of what it offered before I used it. And, Galadriel said. He looked at her. You were right, he said. Both of you. Elrond. All of you. You were right, and I understood that you were right approximately 40 minutes into wearing it, when I realized I had stopped thinking about Sauron and had been thinking for some time about Isengard, and the specific improvements to Isengard that the ring had been very helpfully and quietly suggesting while I believed I was focused on the task at hand. A pause. I took it off. It took considerable effort to take it off. I have not put it on again. How long ago? Mithrandir asked. 4 days. For days with the ring off but the ring present, sitting with it in the forest outside Dol Guldur with Sauron somewhere behind those walls and the understanding that he had been wrong spreading through him the way cold spreads through a body, not all at once, not dramatically, but comprehensively, reaching everywhere eventually. You did not go in, Galadriel said. No, Saruman said. I stood at the gates for a long time. I felt, he paused, choosing words with uncharacteristic difficulty, the precision that normally came easily to him suddenly requiring effort. I felt what Mithrandir described. The awareness inside. Oriented outward. Knowing I was there. He looked at the fortress, invisible through the trees but present in the quality of the air, in the specific texture of the silence in this part of the forest. And I understood that going in wearing the ring in the state I was in, 1 hour of wearing it, 40 minutes of compromised judgment I had not fully recovered from, was not confrontation. It was delivery. He looked at his closed hand again. I have been sitting here for 4 days trying to decide what to do next, he said. I could not go forward. I could not go back. Going forward was what I have described. Going back meant, he stopped. Going back meant arriving at Lothlorien and telling you what I had done. And I found I could not do that either, and I sat here instead. He looked up at Galadriel with the eyes of a man who is past the point of managing his own expression. Until you arrived. Galadriel looked at him for a long time. 15,000 years had given her a thorough education in the taxonomy of human and elvish failure, the ways that pride and intelligence and genuine ability combine to produce exactly the kind of error Saruman had made, the category of mistake that was available only to people smart enough to construct elaborate justifications for what they wanted. She had seen it in Fina, in Celebrimbor, in Elrond, in herself. She had learned to recognize it and had never fully learned to prevent it because preventing it required a kind of preemptive humility that was genuinely difficult for any mind of sufficient power to maintain consistently. What she had not often seen was what came after. The sitting in the ruins. The 4 days on a fallen log in a dark forest with a terrible object in your closed hand and the full knowledge of what you had nearly done and what you had told yourself and what the difference was between those two things. Give it to me, she said. He looked at her. You already held it for 3 centuries. Yes, she said. And I gave it to Mithrandir. She looked at Mithrandir. He looked back at her with the expression of someone who has just been told something he had not expected to be told and is deciding how to respond to it. Galadriel, he began. Not to keep, she said. Not to study. Not to wear. To carry into Dol Guldur and drop into whatever fire is still burning in its depths, because we are here and the fortress is there and we have an army at our backs and a partially recovered Sauron on the other side of those walls who does not yet know that we are more than one man outside his gate. She looked at Saruman, then at Elrond, then at Mithrandir. We came here to deal with Dol Guldur. Let us deal with it. All of it. Today. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences that had preceded it in this conversation. Those had been the silences of people processing and calculating and weighing. This one was the silence of something that had been in motion for a very long time and had finally reached the point where the next step was not a decision but an arrival. Saruman opened his hand. He held the ring out to Galadriel without ceremony, without drama, with the directness of a man who has made a decision and does not want to give himself time to unmake it. She took it. The warmth of it hit her palm immediately, the familiar warmth, the organic impossible warmth of something that had absorbed centuries of being held, and she felt it reach toward her with the precision she had never stopped fearing, finding the shape of what she wanted, finding Lothlorien, finding the light of the Malorn trees and the timelessness of a forest kept outside ordinary decay, finding Celebrian healed and whole and returned across the sea, finding everything she had ever wanted and would still want in any version of herself in any circumstance. She closed her hand. She looked at Mithrandir. Can you get us in? He looked at the forest, at the invisible fortress beyond it, At the sky above Mirkwood that was the wrong color for spring, too heavy, too low, pressing down. He looked like a man consulting something internal, some sense of probability and possibility that was not quite calculation and not quite instinct but somewhere between them. Yes, he said. But we move now. If we wait, whatever is inside will have time to prepare for something larger than one man. Elrond had come forward from the host. He stood beside Galadriel and looked at the ring in her closed hand with the expression of a man looking at something he has a long and complicated history with. He reached out and put his hand over her closed hand, not taking the ring, not touching it, just present. The gesture of someone who understands what someone else is carrying and wants them to know they know. She looked at him. He nodded once. She turned toward the fortress. The host moved behind her, 3,000 years of accumulated grief and patience and the specific stubbornness of people who had outlasted every darkness they had encountered so far and had decided, somewhere along the way, to treat this as a pattern rather than a coincidence. Thranduil's archers moved through the trees on the flanks. Calamon's soldiers formed a center column with the efficiency of people who did not understand what they were marching toward but had decided that this was irrelevant to the marching. Mithrandir was at the front, staff in hand, moving through the corrupted undergrowth with the quality of motion he had when he was genuinely in his element, not comfortable exactly, but suited, the way a tool is suited to the work it was made for. Saruman walked with them. He had left his staff on the fallen log. He walked without it, and without his usual quality of composed superiority, and without anything except the expression of a man who has recently learned something important about himself and is still in the process of deciding what to do with the knowledge. Dol Guldur rose before them through the trees, black stone, ancient, wrong in the specific way that things built with cruelty as their organizing principle are wrong, carrying in their architecture the memory of what they were made for and what has been done in them. The gates were open. Galadriel walked through them with the ring warm in her closed fist and 3 centuries of proximity to it and 3 centuries before that of carrying Nenya and 15,000 years of being herself, all of it, the entire accumulated weight of who she was, brought to bear on the task of not opening her hand. Inside, in the dark, something became aware that she was there. She felt it turn toward her. The specific quality of Sauron's attention, which she had felt once before and had never confused with anything else, the reaching, the precision, the intelligence that was immense and patient and entirely without mercy, oriented now toward the ring in her hand with the focus of something that has been waiting for a very long time and believes its wait is ending. She opened her hand. She looked at the ring one last time. Gold, warm, small, the most dangerous object in the history of the world lying in her palm looking like something someone had dropped and not noticed. She thought, I could still put it on. I could still use it. I could take everything it is offering and become what it wants me to become, and it would be terrible and it would be magnificent, and the word no is the most important word I have ever said, and I am going to say it again now. She threw it into the fire. Not Orodruin. Not the mountain of doom. The fires that burned in the deep places of Dol Guldur, in the forge chambers below the main level where the darkness was oldest and hottest, where Sauron had maintained heat enough for his purposes through centuries of diminished existence. Not the same fire. But fire enough, fire that had been his, fire that remembered what it was made to do, fire that received the ring with a sound that was not quite a sound, a frequency below hearing, a tearing and a resolution simultaneously, the chord of something fundamental coming undone. The ring burned. It did not burn easily. It resisted with everything that had been put into it, 3,000 years of will and intelligence and desire compressed into a circle of gold, fighting the fire the way everything fights its own ending. The warmth in Galadriel's palm became an absence so sudden it felt like cold, felt like the place where a tooth was before it was pulled, felt like the specific shape of a loss. And then it was over. The sound that followed was enormous and had no source. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls of Dol Guldur and the trees of Mirkwood and the sky above and the ground below, a sound like a held breath released after 3,000 years of holding. In the deep chamber, in the forge fire that had consumed the ring, something flared and then went dark with the totality of a light that has no more fuel. In the chamber above, in the main hall of Dol Guldur where the host had entered and spread through the corridors with the efficiency of soldiers who had been given clear orders and were carrying them out, something changed. The resistance stopped. Not the physical resistance. There were still servants of darkness in the fortress, still creatures that would need to be dealt with in the ordinary way of such things. But the organizing intelligence behind the resistance, the thing that had been directing and coordinating and holding the shape of this darkness together with the patient will of something that had survived its own destruction once and fully intended to survive whatever was coming, that stopped. It did not end. Galadriel felt this clearly, felt the absence of the ring and felt simultaneously the continued existence of what had made it, diminished now, genuinely diminished in a way it had not been before the ring burned, stripped of its greatest instrument and of the portion of its fundamental nature it had poured into that instrument, reduced to something smaller and less coherent than it had been. But present. Still somewhere, in some form, in whatever remained when you took everything Sauron had invested in the ring and removed it from the equation. She stood in the forge chamber with her empty hand and felt the shape of what was left, and understood that they had done something real today, something that mattered, something that changed the arithmetic of Middle-earth in ways that would take decades to fully manifest, and that they had not finished. They had never been going to finish today. She had known this when she walked through the gates. The ring was the most urgent thing and the ring was gone, and what remained was the long work, the unglamorous work, the work that would not be remembered in songs because it did not have the shape of songs, the patient, incremental, decade-by-decade work of dealing with what persisted. She walked back through the corridor toward the sound of the host clearing the fortress, and when she came out into the main hall, Mithrandir was there, and Elrond was there, and Saruman was there, and they all looked at her empty hand. "Done," she said. Mithrandir looked at her with the expression he reserved for things that had gone as well as could be hoped and that he was not yet willing to call good news because good news required more information than he currently had. "And Sauron? Diminished," she said. "Not destroyed. Still present somewhere. But, genuinely diminished. More than before. Perhaps enough." "Perhaps enough," Elrond said. Something in his voice made the phrase sound like the most honest thing that had been said in a very long time. Perhaps enough, as a standard, as a measure of success, for people who had learned over very long lives that enough was not always available, and when it was you named it clearly rather than holding out for more. Saruman said nothing. He was looking at where her hand had been closed and was now open, at the absence, and his expression had the quality of a man watching something he had wanted for 3 centuries become inaccessible in the most final possible way and finding that his reaction to this was more complicated than simple loss. Outside, through the walls of Dol Guldur, the light changed. It was subtle, the kind of change that you would not notice if you were not paying attention, and that you could not explain if someone asked you to. The sky above Mirkwood was still too heavy, still the wrong color, still carrying 3 centuries of accumulated shadow in its texture. But something in the quality of the light through the high windows of the fortress was fractionally different than it had been when they entered. Not healed, not restored, not transformed, just slightly less wrong. It was a beginning, not a victory, not an ending, not the resolution of everything that had been set in motion on a burning mountainside 3.5 centuries ago. A beginning, the kind that looks modest from the outside and is only understood in retrospect to have been the turning point, the moment when the direction changed even if the change was not yet visible. Galadriel walked toward the gate. Behind her, the forge fire burned without its purpose, and the walls of Dol Guldur stood empty of the intelligence that had filled them, and somewhere in the diminished spaces of what remained of Sauron's will, something very old and very patient took stock of what it had lost and began, as it always began, the slow work of deciding what came next. But that was his work, not hers. Hers was outside, in the partially healed light, in the long road back, in the decades of work that had perhaps enough demanded of the people who had achieved it. She walked toward it without hesitating. Sauron did not announce his survival. This was, in retrospect, the most telling thing about what he had become, not the silence itself, which could have been weakness, but the quality of the silence, the way it had the texture of choice rather than incapacity. Something that was merely diminished went quiet because it had no alternative. Something that was diminished and patient went quiet because it understood that quiet was, in the current configuration of forces, the most effective thing it could be. The host rode out of Mirkwood in the early days of summer, and behind them Dol Guldur stood empty in the way that a shell is empty, the structure intact, the inhabitant gone, the question of whether gone meant destroyed or relocated left open in the way that questions left open by enemies are always the most expensive kind. Thranduil's archers spread back through the forest in the weeks that followed, reclaiming territory that had been yielded to shadow over centuries of slow retreat, and what they found was that the forest responded. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the way that living things respond when the pressure that has been suppressing them is removed, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, the undergrowth thinning, the canopy lightening, the specific quality of darkness that had characterized Mirkwood for 3 centuries beginning to lift in patches. It would take generations. Galadriel knew this. Centuries of corruption did not reverse in a season. But the reversal had begun, and beginning was not nothing. She returned to Lothlorien and sat for a long time in the silence of a valley that felt, For the first time since she had accepted the ring from Elrond 3.5 centuries ago, simply like itself. Nenya was still on her finger. The low hum that Nenya generated was still present, the ambient presence of a ring of power doing what it had been doing for 3,000 years. But the other frequency, the undertone, the conversation she had never fully been able to block, the sound of the one ring existing and reaching from wherever it was being kept, was gone. The absence of it was extraordinary. She had not understood how present it had been until it was not. She sat with the absence for 3 days before she was ready to think about what came next. What came next, she understood, was the long accounting. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that generated stories or songs, but necessary in the way that all reckonings are necessary, the honest assessment of what 3.5 centuries of the ring's presence in the world had done, what it had changed, what damage was permanent and what was recoverable, what they now faced that they would not have faced if the ring had gone into Orodruin on the day Sauron fell. The accounting was not encouraging. Saruman was the most visible item in it. He had returned to Isengard after Dol Guldur, declining the offer of rest in Lothlorien with a courtesy that was entirely genuine and entirely evasive, genuinely grateful, genuinely preferring to be somewhere that was his own, genuinely needing the specific solitude of a place where he was in charge of what he encountered rather than encountered by what others chose to show him. Galadriel had let him go without pressing. She had watched him ride south with the expression she had learned to maintain when watching people make choices she understood and could not prevent. Mithrandir had gone with him for part of the journey, the two of them traveling together for several weeks before Mithrandir peeled off toward the Shire, which was apparently where he went when he needed to think, or when he needed to not think, in the specific company of people who were very good at not thinking about large dark things and were happy to share this skill. He had said nothing specific to Galadriel about Saruman before he left. He had given her a look that communicated something in the efficient way that their long acquaintance allowed, and she had received it, and what it said was, "He is not finished with this." Not in a dangerous way. Not yet. But not finished. She had written it down, which she rarely did with such assessments. She wanted a record that did not depend on her memory, which was reliable but not infallible, which might in the years ahead need to be checked against what she was seeing in the present to determine whether a pattern was developing or whether she was imposing a pattern that confirmed an existing fear. Elrond had returned to Rivendell, and she had visited him there in the first autumn after Dol Guldur, and they had sat together in the library where he had been spending most of his time, surrounded by the accumulated records of every age of the world that had left any record, and she had watched him read with the quality of attention he had developed in the years of his recovery. Present, genuinely present, not the performed presence of someone managing their engagement with the world, but actual contact between a mind and what it was looking at. "How are you?" she had asked. "Better than I have been in a very long time," he had said. Which is a lower bar than it sounds, given what I have been. It is an honest answer. I have been trying to give those. She had smiled at him, which she did not do reflexively or often, and he had received it with the slight surprise of a man who had not yet fully recalibrated to being in the company of people who were glad he was himself. They had talked about the accounting, about what the ring's 3.5 centuries in the world had changed, not only what had happened, which could be catalogued, but the more difficult question of what would now not happen, the alterations in the shape of the future that resulted from the alterations in the shape of the past. Some things were clear. Isildur had not died at the Gladden Fields, or rather, he had died there, ambushed by orcs in the dark, but he had not died with the ring, and so the ring had not passed into the river Anduin, and the question of what the river had or had not preserved had not arisen. The line of Isildur continued. His sons had ruled in Orna as they had in any version of events, and Orna had fallen as it fell in all versions. That was not the ring's doing, that was the work of the Witch King of Angmar, whose power had its own origins and its own trajectory independent of the One Ring's whereabouts. But the Witch King was diminished now. This was something they had not fully anticipated before Dol Guldur, that the ring's destruction would affect the Nine in ways that were not yet fully visible but were already being felt at the margins. The ring wreaths drew their existence through the 9 rings of men, which were bound to the one, which was gone. They did not dissolve. The binding was indirect enough, the long centuries of transformation deep enough, that they persisted. But they persisted as something less than they had been. The specific quality of terror they generated in their full manifestation reduced, their capacity for physical action in the world narrowed, their ability to move freely in daylight restricted in ways that had not applied before. This was significant. Not decisive. They were still the Nazgul, still the embodiment of a particular kind of ancient and absolute wrong, but significant. Changed. Recoverable from, perhaps, by the peoples of Middle-earth who had been living under their shadow for an age. The men of Gondor were the hardest part of the accounting, and Galadriel spent the most time on them, not because the arithmetic was complicated but because it was sad in the specific way of things that were sad without being anyone's fault, or rather sad in the way of things where fault was distributed so widely and historically that assigning it was less useful than simply holding the sadness and understanding what it meant. Gondor had been without a king since Erna, the last king, had ridden to Minas Morgul in answer to the Witch King's challenge and not come back. The stewards ruled in his stead, capable men in a long line of capable men doing the best that capable men could do with a kingdom that was not quite a kingdom and a throne that was not quite empty. The line of Anarion was intact. The line of Isildur was intact. The possibility of restoration, of a king returned, of the two lines united, of Orna and Gondor rejoined, was theoretically present. Theoretically. The word carried everything it needed to carry. The practical distance between theoretical possibility and actual restoration was measured in generations and politics and the specific difficulty of convincing people who had been governing themselves adequately for centuries that they needed something they had managed without. It was not impossible. Galadriel did not think it was impossible. But it required someone. A specific person, of the right lineage and the right quality, at the right moment, willing to make the claim and capable of making it stick. She had been thinking about the Rangers. The Dunedain of the north, the remnant of Orna's people, wandering the wilderness in small companies, keeping watch over lands that no longer knew their names, maintaining a tradition of service without recognition that was, when she thought about it carefully, which she did, one of the more extraordinary things she had witnessed in 15,000 years. A people who continued to be what they were in the absence of any institutional structure requiring it, simply because they had decided that being it mattered. There would be a child eventually. There was always a child, in these lines that went back to Numena and before that to the marriages between elves and men that the Valar themselves had blessed. The line produced what the line needed, not always at the right moment, not always in the right form, but with a consistency that Galadriel had learned to trust the way she trusted deep patterns rather than surface events. She did not know when. She did not know what form it would take. She knew only that the work she had done, that all of them had done, in Dol Guldur and in the 3.5 centuries before it, had not ended anything but had perhaps cleared the ground for something. Had perhaps removed the obstacle most likely to prevent the necessary thing from happening. Perhaps. The word she had used at Dol Guldur, in the forge chamber with her empty hand. Perhaps enough. She was learning to live in perhaps. It was not comfortable. It was not what 15,000 years of operating at the highest levels of power and knowledge had prepared her for. Certainty had always been available to her, or something close enough to certainty that the difference rarely mattered. Now she sat with perhaps and found that it demanded a different kind of courage than certainty did. Certainty required you to act on what you knew. Perhaps required you to act on what you did not know, to move in the direction of something you could not yet see clearly, to trust that the pattern would hold even when the current data points were insufficient to confirm it. She was, she thought, learning something she should have learned much earlier. Something the hobbits probably knew instinctively, which was perhaps why Mithrandir went to them when he needed to remember it. In the 3rd year after Dol Guldur, she received a letter from Saruman. It was long and careful and covered several subjects before arriving at the one she had known it was about from the first line. He had been, he wrote, conducting research. Not into the One Ring. He was careful and specific about this, careful enough that the carefulness itself was informative, but into the nature of the rings of power more broadly, into the theory of their construction, into the question of what it meant that Celebrimbor had made them with Anatar's guidance and what that meant for their essential character. He had developed views on this. He believed there were implications for the 3 that had not been fully examined. He thought the council should meet. Galadriel read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table in front of her and sat with it for a long time. He was not wrong that there were questions about the 3 that had not been fully examined. He was not wrong that Celebrimbor's collaboration with Anatar left open questions about how much of Anatar's design philosophy had infected even the rings that had been made after the One Ring's forging had revealed his true intent. These were real questions. Legitimate questions. The kind of questions that a genuine scholar of ring lore would naturally be asking in the aftermath of the One Ring's destruction. They were also the kind of questions that someone who had spent 3.5 centuries developing an expertise in rings of power and had watched the most powerful of them all disappear might ask for reasons that had less to do with scholarship and more to do with the specific shape of an interest that had not been resolved by Dol Guldur, only redirected. She wrote back. She agreed to a council. She set the location as Rivendell, which was Elrond's ground and therefore neutral in a way that Isengard and Lothlorien were not. She named a date 2 years away, which was long enough to seem unhurried and was not so long as to seem like avoidance. Then she wrote to Mithrandir and told him what Saruman's letter had said and what she had replied and what she thought it meant. Mithrandir's reply came from somewhere in the north, in his characteristic handwriting that looked like a man writing in a hurry but contained upon examination exactly as much information as it intended to and no more. He wrote, "I know. I have been watching Isengard. Not constantly, he would notice constant watching, but the view from the road north is sufficient. He has been making modifications. The wheel was my first concern. A water wheel is not in itself alarming. The quality of attention he is giving it is." She set the letter down beside Saruman's. 2 letters, 2 different kinds of intelligence about the same person, pointing in the same direction, adding up to something that was not yet a crisis and was not nothing. The ring was gone. Sauron was diminished. Dol Guldur was empty. The ring wreaths were reduced. The forest of Mirkwood was slowly healing. Elrond was recovering. The line of Isildur continued. The Dunedain kept their watch. And Saruman was in Isengard, giving a water wheel the kind of attention that warranted noting. Perhaps enough, Galadriel thought. She had said it at Dol Guldur and had meant it as a measure of success. She was beginning to understand that it was also a description of the permanent condition of people who cared about the world, that enough was always perhaps, that the work was always continuing, that the ground cleared by one effort immediately became the ground on which the next effort was required. This was not despair. She was careful to be precise about this, to herself, in the privacy of her own thinking where precision was possible without the mediation of words. It was not despair, because despair required the belief that the effort was futile, and she did not believe that. She had seen too much. She had been present for too many moments when the necessary thing happened at the last possible time in the least likely way, when the pattern held despite every reason it should have broken, when the world demonstrated, once more, the stubborn persistence of the things worth preserving. She believed in the pattern. She believed in it the way she believed in Nenya, the way she believed in the light of the Malorn trees, the way she believed in the faces of the people she had loved for 15,000 years, not because she could prove it, but because she had been present for enough of its demonstrations to have earned the belief honestly. She picked up a pen. She began to write, not a letter this time, but something longer, something she had been deferring for decades without quite acknowledging the deferral. A record, not of events which were already recorded in the library at Rivendell, but of the understanding that events had produced, what 3.5 centuries of the ring's presence in the world, of watching it work and fighting it and failing to destroy it and finally destroying it, had taught her about the nature of power and the nature of corruption and the nature of the slow patient courage required to address both. She wrote for a long time. She wrote until the light changed in the Malorn trees and the stars came out over Lothlorien and the valley settled into the particular quality of its evening silence, which was the silence of a place that had been kept outside ordinary time by the will of its keeper and was still, despite everything, still itself. She kept writing. Outside, Middle-earth continued its long work of being Middle-earth, imperfect, endangered, stubbornly present, full of people doing the best they could with the information they had and the time they were given, which was never enough and was always, somehow, sufficient. She wrote it all down. The council at Rivendell convened in the autumn of the 5th century of the Third Age, which was late enough that the trees in the valley had turned to gold and the air had the quality that Elrond had always associated with the season, clear, precise, carrying sound further than summer did, as if the world were paying closer attention to itself. Saruman arrived first. He came with a small retinue, 2 assistants and a cartographer whose presence Galadriel noted and filed without commenting on, and he moved through Rivendell with the ease of a man who had been in many places and found them all ultimately legible. He had changed since Dol Guldur. Not dramatically, the white robes were the same, the bearing was the same, the particular quality of composed authority he projected was the same. But there was something different in the way he occupied space, quality of expansion, as if Isengard had agreed with him in ways that had made him more thoroughly himself. Whether the self that had expanded was the self worth expanding was the question Galadriel held quietly as she watched him settle into Rivendell's rhythms. Mithrandir arrived the evening before the council was to begin, which was typical. He managed his arrivals with the precision of someone who understood that when you arrived determined what conversations you were available for before the official conversations began. He came to Galadriel's rooms without being summoned and sat down in the chair that Elrond kept there because she visited often enough to warrant a chair, and he looked at her with the expression that meant he had been thinking about something for a long time and had reached the point where thinking had become insufficient. He has found something, Mithrandir said. Tell me. I am not certain what it is. That is the honest answer, and I want to give you the honest answer rather than the more dramatic one. He paused. He has been in the archives at Orthanc, the records that were there when he took up residence, documents from the Second Age that predate the last alliance. Accounts of Anatar's time in a region. Not the accounts that survive in Rivendell's library, different accounts, written from closer, by people who were present for things that the more distant records only describe. What things? The making of the 7 and the 9, Mithrandir said. Not the 3 were Celebrimber's own work, made before the One Ring revealed Anatar's purpose, before the corruption was complete. But the 7 and the 9 were collaborative, and the collaboration was specific. Anatar directed it in ways that the surviving accounts are vague about, and Saruman has found accounts that are less vague. Galadriel was quiet for a moment. What did he learn? I don't know the specifics, Mithrandir said. What I know is the quality of his attention after he found them. I was in Isengard for 3 weeks in the spring, he invited me, which itself warranted attention, and I watched him with those documents and I watched him without them, and the difference was, he paused, choosing the word, illuminated. As if something had clicked into a position it had been approaching for a long time. And he has said nothing to us about it. He is saying it now. Or he is about to. Mithrandir looked at his hands. That is why he called the council. The council convened the next morning in the hall that Elrond used for significant gatherings, not the great hall where feasts were held, which was too large and too festive for this kind of conversation, but a smaller room with windows that looked out over the valley and a table long enough for the number of people present without being so long that the ends felt disconnected from the center. Elrond sat at one end. Galadriel sat at his right. Mithrandir sat beside her. Saruman sat at the table's other end, which was a positioning choice that everyone present understood and no one remarked upon. Saruman began without preamble, which was itself a signal. He had learned, somewhere in the years since Dol Guldur, that preambles invited the kind of preemptive objection that could derail a presentation before it had made its case. The 7 and the 9 were made differently than we have understood, he said. Not differently in their basic construction, the metallurgy, the enchantment, the binding to the One Ring, all of this is as the surviving histories describe. Differently in their purpose. The accounts I have found in Orthanc's archive suggest that Anatar designed them not primarily as instruments of power for their bearers but as receivers, recording instruments. The rings were made to absorb the experience of their bearers over time, to accumulate within their structure a record of everything the bearer encountered and thought and desired and feared. The room was quiet. Why? Elrond said. Because Anatar was Sauron, Saruman said, and Sauron was always building toward the same thing, dominion, and dominion requires knowledge, and knowledge requires intelligence gathering, and the rings of power distributed among the most powerful men and dwarfs in the world were the most comprehensive intelligence gathering system ever devised. He was not merely controlling his ring bearers. He was learning from them, accumulating, through them, a map of human and dwarven desire and weakness so thorough that any future effort at dominion would begin with an advantage no enemy had ever possessed. The One Ring's destruction would have ended that system, Galadriel said. Yes, Saruman said. The 7 and 9 are inert now, not destroyed, but disconnected, no longer transmitting whatever they accumulated to whatever received it. What I am describing is historical, not current. He paused. Mostly. The word landed in the room with the specific weight of a word chosen to land with weight. Explain mostly, Mithrandir said. Saruman looked at him with the expression of a man arriving at the part of the presentation he has been building toward. The 3, he said. Celebrimber's rings. Made, as all the accounts agree, before Anatar revealed himself, before the corruption, before the One Ring was forged. Made in awareness of the techniques Anatar had shared but not in collaboration with him, not under his supervision, not with his specific design philosophy deliberately incorporated. We have always understood this, Elrond said. We have understood the positive version of it, Saruman said. That the 3 were free from Sauron's direct influence. What we have not examined is the negative version, what the 3 are free from, specifically, and what that freedom implies about their structure. He looked around the table. The 7 and 9 were made to receive, to accumulate and transmit. Celebrimber made the 3 without that design, which means he made them without understanding what he was leaving out. The 3 do not transmit. But the question I have been unable to resolve, he paused. Do they record? The silence that followed was the silence of people encountering a question they had not previously considered and recognizing immediately that they should have. Galadriel looked at Nenya on her finger. She had worn it for 3,000 years. She had worn it through everything, through the making of Lothlorien, through the War of the Last Alliance, through 3.5 centuries of the One Ring's presence in the world, through Dol Guldur. She had never asked what it was doing while she wore it, beyond what she knew it was doing, preserving, maintaining, extending her will into the valley she had built and tended. She had never asked what it was learning. "You have been studying your own ring," she said to Saruman. "I do not bear one of the three," he said. "No," she said. "But you have been studying what the three might contain." A pause. "Yes. And what have you concluded?" Saruman looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has concluded something and is deciding how much of the conclusion to share with people he expects will not receive it well. "That the three may contain the most comprehensive record of the Elder Days and the early Third Age that exists anywhere," he said. "Not in a form that can be read, not as text or image, but as accumulated experience. Everything that Elrond has lived and thought and known while wearing Vilya is in Vilya, or some portion of it. Everything you have known while wearing Nenya. Gil-galad's knowledge while he held Narya before he gave it to Mithrandir." He looked at Mithrandir with a quality of attention that Galadriel watched carefully. "Everything Mithrandir has encountered since receiving Narya." Mithrandir said nothing. His face was doing something it rarely did, which was nothing, blank, still, offering no surface for inference. "The records in Rivendell's library are extraordinary," Saruman continued. "But they are records of what people chose to write down, what they believed was worth preserving, what survived the physical disasters of successive ages. The rings would contain what was never written down. What was felt and perceived and understood in the moment and then, not forgotten exactly, but unrecorded. The interior history of 3,000 years. And you want to access it," Elrond said. "I want to understand whether it can be accessed," Saruman said. "Those are different things." "Less different than you suggest," Mithrandir said. It was the first thing he had said since mostly, and he said it quietly and without emphasis, which made it land harder than it would have with either. Saruman looked at him. "You disagree with the inquiry." "I disagree with the direction the inquiry is pointing," Mithrandir said. "Which is not the same thing." He settled back slightly in his chair, the movement of a man organizing his thoughts rather than retreating. "You have described something real. The question of what the three contain is a real question. The possibility that they hold records of the kind you describe is genuinely interesting, and the implications, if true, are significant." He paused. "I am more concerned with what you intend to do with the answer." "Knowledge," Saruman said, "requires no justification beyond itself." "Knowledge acquired by doing what, specifically?" Mithrandir said. The question sat in the room. Saruman looked at Mithrandir with the expression of a man who has been asked the question he was hoping to defer and is deciding whether deferral is still possible. "There are techniques," Saruman said carefully, "derived from the same theoretical framework that explains the ring's recording function, that might allow an external mind to interface with what has been recorded, without modifying the ring, without wearing it, from outside, in a structured and controlled." "No," Elrond said. Everyone looked at him. He had said it without drama, without raising his voice, without the rhetorical architecture that he might once have constructed around such a refusal. Just the word, flat and final, in the voice of a man who has been through enough to know where sentences like structured and controlled end. "The argument you are making," Elrond said, "is the argument I made for a century. The terms are different. The conclusion is the same." He looked at Saruman without anger and without patience, simply with the directness of someone who has used up every less direct approach available. "You are describing a method of interacting with a ring of power that does not involve wearing it, and you are framing this as a meaningful distinction. It is not a meaningful distinction. The ring does not care about the formality of wearing. It cares about engagement. Any sufficiently deep engagement is sufficient for its purposes." "Vilya is not the One Ring," Saruman said. "No," Elrond said. "And I am not the One Ring's bearer. And yet here we are, 10 years after Dol Guldur, still having the same conversation in a different form." He looked at Saruman for a long moment. "I am not questioning your intelligence or your discipline or the sincerity of your interest. I am questioning the premise that any of those things are sufficient protection. They were not sufficient for me. I do not believe they would be sufficient for you." Saruman looked at him. Something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and not quite acknowledgement and occupied the complicated space between them. Galadriel had been watching all of this with the attention she brought to things that were important and that she was not yet ready to speak about, waiting for the moment when speaking would be more useful than watching. She thought that moment had arrived. "There is something you have not said," she said to Saruman. He looked at her. "You have described what the three might contain," she said. "You have described techniques for accessing it. You have not described what you would do with what you found." She held his gaze with the directness that 15,000 years had made available to her, not intimidation, not power, simply the quality of attention that made evasion feel more expensive than honesty. "Tell us what you are actually trying to build." The room was quiet. Outside, the Valley of Rivendell was doing what it always did, which was being itself with the unhurried permanence of something that had been built on the principle that some things were worth preserving, that beauty was not frivolity, that the past was not past but was the foundation on which any future worth having had to stand. Saruman looked at Galadriel for a long time. Then he looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked out the window at the valley, at the waterfalls and the autumn trees and the specific quality of Rivendell's light, which was different from ordinary light in ways that could not be fully articulated but were immediately apparent to anyone who had spent any time there. When he spoke, his voice had lost the quality of a presentation and had something more like a confession in it, not remorse exactly, but the sound of a man speaking without the architecture he usually spoke inside. "A countermeasure," he said. "Sauron is not gone. We established this at Dol Guldur, diminished, yes, genuinely diminished, but present, still patient, still building. I have been watching the directions from which the next effort will come, and what I see is, he has lost the ring, he has lost the intelligence network the 7 and 9 represented, he has lost the specific instruments of dominion that defined his method in the Second Age. He will not use the same method again. He cannot. What he will use instead is something we have not encountered, shaped by everything he learned in the Second Age but not bounded by the forms that experience took." He paused. "I want to know what he learned. I want to know what 3,000 years of intelligence gathered through the rings of men and dwarfs taught him about us, about what we want and what we fear and where we can be reached. I want to know it before he uses it." The room absorbed this. It was, Galadriel thought, the most honest thing Saruman had said at any council she had attended. It was also, in its honesty, more concerning than the things he had said when he was being less honest, because it revealed the specific shape of the fear underneath the inquiry, a fear she recognized, because she had held versions of it herself, the fear that the enemy knew you better than you knew yourself, the fear that the next attack would come from a direction you had not prepared for, the fear that preparation required information you did not have. The fear was legitimate. The method he proposed to address it was not. He did not learn it from the three, Galadriel said. The three were not his instruments. Whatever he gathered through the 7 and 9, whatever map of human and dwarven weakness he built over 3,000 years, Vilya did not contribute to it. Nenya did not contribute to it. Narya did not contribute to it. She paused. What we know that he does not is exactly what the three contain, the history of the elder days as it was lived by the people who tried to preserve rather than dominate, who built refuges instead of fortresses, who kept the light rather than harnessing it. She looked at Saruman steadily. We do not need to extract that knowledge from the rings. We need to use it. We have been using it. We are the knowledge, Saruman. It is not stored somewhere separate from us that requires a technique to access. It is what we are. Saruman looked at her for a long moment. His expression had the quality she had seen before on his face, the expression of a man who has heard something that addresses the surface of his concern without touching the depth of it, who recognizes the wisdom in what he has been told and finds it, nonetheless, insufficient. He did not say this. He said, "Perhaps you are right." And the quality of his saying it was the quality of a man who has decided to continue the conversation elsewhere, in a form that does not require permission. Mithrandir heard it too. She could tell from the way he did not react, the stillness of someone who has registered something and chosen not to amplify it by responding. The council continued through the afternoon and into the evening, moving through other matters, the state of Mirkwood, the Dunedain and their dwindling numbers, the question of Gondor's stewardship and the empty throne, the slow changes in the world that the Ring's destruction had set in motion and that were still working themselves out across the landscape of Middle-earth in ways that would take generations to fully manifest. Saruman participated in all of these discussions with the precision and genuine intelligence that had always characterized him, offering analysis that was often correct and occasionally essential, being the council member he had always been. Galadriel watched him being it and thought about the distance between what someone was in their good moments and what they were building toward in the spaces between those moments, and how long that distance could be maintained before it collapsed in one direction or the other. She stayed in Rivendell for a week after the council ended. She spent time with Elrond in the library, in the evenings, in the specific companionship they had developed over centuries of shared difficulty, not always talking, sometimes simply present in the same space in the way that people who have been through things together can be present without requiring words to justify the presence. On the last evening, Elrond said, "He is not going to stop. No, Galadriel said. What do we do? Watch, she said. And trust that the pattern holds. She paused. And when it does not hold, act. That is not a plan, Elrond said. No, she agreed. It is something better than a plan. It is an orientation. She looked out the window at the valley in its autumn evening light, at the thing Elrond had built and tended and almost lost and recovered, at the particular beauty of a place that existed because someone had decided it was worth the effort of existing. Plans assume you know what is coming. An orientation allows you to respond to what actually arrives. Elrond was quiet for a moment. That is very wise, he said. I find it unsatisfying. I know, she said. It took me a long time to stop finding it unsatisfying. She left the next morning. She rode back toward Lothlorien through the autumn landscape of Eriador, through the long miles of wilderness that the Dunedain kept watch over without recognition, and she thought about what Saruman had said and what he had not said and what the distance between those two things was likely to produce over the decades and centuries ahead. She thought about Sauron, somewhere in the east, patient and diminished and learning from his losses with the intelligence that had always been his most dangerous quality, not his power, which could be broken, but his capacity to understand failure and incorporate it into the next attempt. She thought about the Dunedain, wandering their wilderness, keeping their watch, maintaining in their blood and their tradition the lineage that the world did not yet know it was going to need. She thought about a child not yet born, in a line not yet at its necessary moment, carrying in their ancestry every convergence of the ages, Ildar and Edain and the long patient work of people who had continued to be what they were even when no institution required it. She thought, the pattern holds. She thought, it will hold. She rode west through the autumn afternoon, and Middle-earth spread out around her in all its imperfect stubborn beauty, and she held the thought carefully, the way you hold something that is both true and fragile, and she did not let it go. Sauron's silence lasted 10 years. Not passive silence, active silence, the silence of something that had learned from every previous version of itself that announced its intentions too early and had incorporated that lesson so thoroughly that the silence itself had become a method. Galadriel felt it through Nenya, in the changed frequency that had characterized the ring since the One Ring's destruction, the absence of the undertone that had been present for 3.5 centuries. The connection was gone, but direction remained, something coming from the east, not from Mordor, further than Mordor, more diffuse, the quality of a purpose that has not yet found its form but is already oriented toward finding it. During those 10 years Saruman worked. Worked was the word his assistants used when they corresponded with Rivendell, which they did with the regularity of people who had been instructed to maintain appearances of normalcy and were doing so with the slight excess of effort that always characterizes performed normalcy. Saruman was working. Saruman was researching. Saruman was engaged in the kind of deep scholarly inquiry that occasionally produced results of significance to the wider council and would be shared at the appropriate time. Mithrandir visited Isengard twice during those 10 years. The first visit was in the 3rd year, and he came back to Lothlorien with the expression of a man who has seen something he is still processing and sat with Galadriel for 2 days in the manner of someone organizing his impressions before committing them to language. The wheel, he said finally. Tell me about the wheel. It is no longer a water wheel, he said. Or it is still a water wheel in the sense that it still turns in the water, but what it is driving has changed. The mechanisms connected to it are, I could not see all of them. He showed me some. What I saw was sophisticated enough that what I could not see concerned me more than what I could. What is he making? I don't know, Mithrandir said. That is the honest answer and the concerning one. After 1,000 years of watching Saruman I could not determine from what I saw what he is ultimately building toward. The components I recognized were individually unremarkable. Their combination was not. He paused. He is applying to physical mechanism the same principles that the rings apply to influence. Extension of will through instrument. He is trying to replicate in iron and water and fire what Celebrimbor achieved in gold. Galadriel looked at him for a long time. Without the rings. Without the rings, Mithrandir confirmed. Or, not quite without. I believe the theoretical foundation comes from his study of the rings. What they were, how they worked, what principles underlay the specific effects they produced. He is translating that theory into a different medium. Can it be done? Mithrandir was quiet for a moment. I don't know, he said, which from him meant he thought the answer was possibly yes and found this deeply uncomfortable. The second visit was in the 8th year, and he came back differently. Not distressed, Mithrandir did not distress easily, had developed over 1,000 years of difficult work, the specific equanimity of a mind that has been in enough genuinely bad situations to have calibrated its alarm responses accurately. But he came back with a quality of settled concern that was in some ways more informative than distress would have been, because it told her that what he had seen was real and specific and had already been fully processed rather than still arriving. He told her what he had seen. The mechanisms had grown. The valley around Isengard's tower was being reshaped in ways that were no longer subtle: excavations, foundries, the systematic clearing of the forest that had surrounded Orthanc for as long as anyone remembered. The trees were being cut not for lumber but for fuel, feeding furnaces that ran continuously, producing something that was emerging from Isengard's depths with the specific quality of things made by a process that did not have a name yet because nothing quite like it had existed before. And Saruman himself, Mithrandir described him with the precision that distinguished his observations from anyone else's, the precision of a mind that had spent 1,000 years looking at things clearly and reporting what was actually there rather than what he expected or feared to find. Saruman was well. Saruman was energized. Saruman was more fully himself than he had been at any of the councils, more present, more engaged, with the quality of a man who has found the work that matches the full extent of his ability and is no longer operating below capacity. This, Mithrandir said, was the most concerning thing. Galadriel agreed. Saruman diminished and frustrated was Saruman constrained. Saruman energized and purposeful and in possession of a project that matched his full capability was something that required more careful attention than any version of him she had observed before. She called a council. Not in Rivendell this time, in Lothlorien, on her ground, in a space where she controlled the conditions in ways that Rivendell's hospitality did not permit. She invited Saruman with the courtesy that the council's functioning required, and she invited Elrond, and she told Mithrandir what she was planning, and he arrived 3 days before the others and spent those 3 days in the particular way he spent time when he was preparing for something, not visibly preparing, not discussing or rehearsing, just present in the valley with the heightened quality of attention he brought to things that mattered. Saruman came. He came as he always came, composed, immaculate, with the bearing of a man who exists in a state of continuous readiness for whatever the encounter requires. He looked at Lothlorien with the appreciation of someone who recognized beauty without being moved by it, which was itself a kind of information about what he had become. The council met in the open air, which was Galadriel's choice and which Saruman understood as a choice. No walls. No contained space. The malorn trees around them, the light that was specific to Lothlorien filtering through gold leaves, the sense of a valley that existed outside ordinary time. All of this was statement as much as setting, and Saruman was precise enough to read it. "You have concerns about Isengard," he said, before anyone else had spoken. "Yes," Galadriel said. "Then I will address them directly." He looked at each of them in turn, Galadriel, Elrond, Mithrandir, with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment not in the sense of having scripted it but in the sense of having thought it through completely enough that he knows where all the possible lines of argument lead. "I have been developing a capacity. Not a weapon, I want to be precise about this, because the word weapon carries implications that do not apply to what I am building. A capacity for production. For making things at a scale and speed that has not previously been available to the people who are trying to hold this world together." "What kind of things?" Elrond said. "Whatever is needed," Saruman said. "That is the point, the capacity is general. It can produce tools or structures or, yes, armaments, if armaments become necessary, which based on what we know about Sauron's continued existence seems likely rather than possible." He paused. "We destroyed the ring. We diminished Sauron. We did not end the threat, and we have spent a century since Dol Guldur with no answer to the question of what we do when the threat reconstitutes itself. I have been building an answer." "You have been building an army," Mithrandir said. "I have been building the capacity to build an army," Saruman said. "If one is needed. There is a distinction." "Less meaningful than you suggest," Mithrandir said. For the second time in their history together he used the same phrase to the same person in the same context, and Galadriel thought that this repetition was itself a kind of statement, that the conversation they were having now was the same conversation they had always been having with Saruman, in different rooms, with different specific content, circling the same center. "The world is changing," Saruman said. He said it without drama, as a simple observation, which made it more compelling than it would have been said dramatically. "The elves are leaving. Not all at once, gradually, over centuries, but the direction is clear and it will not reverse. The Dunedain are dwindling. Gondor is ruled by stewards who will never claim the kingship because the kingship has become a kind of religion and religions are more comfortable as aspirations than as actualities. The men who remain are not the men of Numenor, not in capability or in will or in the specific quality of courage that Elendil's people possessed." He looked around at them. "What we will have, when Sauron moves again, is less than what we had when we fought him before. And what we had before was barely sufficient. This was also true. Galadriel held it as true without letting it become the argument's conclusion, because true premises did not automatically validate the conclusions built on them. And your answer to this, she said, is Isengard. My answer to this is preparation, he said. Isengard is where the preparation is happening. The preparation is not the answer, it is the precondition for an answer. What is the answer? She said. He looked at her. Someone has to be willing to hold the line, he said. Not retreat to Valinor. Not wander the wilderness giving encouragement to hobbits. Not preserve a beautiful valley outside ordinary time. He said none of this with cruelty, he said it with the flat clarity of a man stating what he sees. Someone has to be willing to meet the next age on its own terms, with the tools the next age requires, and do the work that the next age makes necessary. And that someone is you, Elrond said. I am the head of the Istari Order, Saruman said. I was sent here for this purpose. Not to advise from a distance. To act. The council continued through the afternoon and did not resolve. Councils with Saruman never resolved, they documented, they recorded, they established where positions were and how far apart they stood, and then they ended and everyone returned to what they had been doing and the positions continued to diverge on their established trajectories. Galadriel let it end without forcing a resolution that was not available. She watched Saruman ride south out of Lothlorien the next morning and she stood at the border the way she stood at borders when she was not certain she was watching a departure rather than a farewell. Mithrandir stood beside her. He is not wrong about everything, she said. No, Mithrandir said. He is almost never wrong about everything. That is precisely the problem. The next age will be harder than this one. Yes. And we will have less. Yes, he said. We will have less of the old things. I have been thinking for some time about whether that is entirely loss. He looked at the road south, at the empty space where Saruman had been. The old things were very powerful. They were also what Sauron built his methods around, what he knew, what he had studied, what he had spent 3,000 years learning to manipulate and subvert and corrupt. He paused. Something he has never encountered might be harder to corrupt. Something small and unheroic and entirely outside the frameworks his intelligence was gathered to understand. Galadriel looked at him. He was not looking at her, he was looking at the road, at the horizon, at something she could not see or was not yet looking for. You are thinking about the Shire, she said. I am thinking about the Shire, he confirmed. Hobbits, she said. Not dismissively, she had learned, over the long centuries of Mithrandir's acquaintance, to take seriously the things he returned to repeatedly. Hobbits, he said. They have lived in the margins of every great event in the Third Age and been untouched by all of them. Not because they are weak, because they are beneath the notice of everything that organizes itself around power. Sauron's entire intelligence apparatus was designed around the assumption that what mattered was what was powerful. The 7 and 9 recorded the experience of the mighty. The One Ring sought bearers of significant will. He paused. What it never mapped was insignificance. What it never understood was the specific quality of a people who want nothing that power can provide and therefore cannot be reached by the methods power uses. Galadriel thought about this for a long time. The malon trees around them were moving slightly in a morning breeze, their gold leaves catching the early light in the way they always did, the specific beauty of a place maintained by will and love across 3,000 years, still here, still itself, still holding. The line of Isildur will produce what it needs to produce, she said. Eventually, Mithrandir agreed. And the Shire will produce what it needs to produce, and we will not know in advance what that is, and we will probably underestimate it when it arrives. You will not underestimate it. No, he said. I have been paying attention for too long. She looked at him, at the face that had spent 1,000 years being genuinely present in Middle-earth, eating its food and breathing its air and caring about its smallest inhabitants with a seriousness that no one else in his order had ever quite managed. The face of a Maya who had taken on the limitation of mortality and found in that limitation not diminishment but a kind of understanding unavailable to those who stood outside it. Go to the Shire, she said. When this council's business is finished. Spend time there. Watch what is growing. I had already planned to, he said. I know, she said. They stood together for a little longer in the morning light, two of the oldest minds in Middle-earth looking at a horizon neither of them could see past clearly, holding between them the accumulated weight of everything that had happened and the open question of everything that had not yet happened. Then Mithrandir said, Galadriel. Yes. We are going to be all right. He said it not with the confidence of certainty but with the conviction of someone who has looked at the evidence carefully and reached a conclusion. Not without cost. not without loss. But, all right. In the end. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Lothlorien, at the valley she had built and tended across 3,000 years of everything the world could produce to make building and tending difficult. At the light in the malorn trees. At the river below, moving with the unhurried permanence of water that does not know and does not need to know what it is flowing toward. Yes, she said. In the end. She believed it. She had earned the belief. And belief, honestly earned, held against the full weight of everything that argued against it. This was perhaps the most durable thing she had discovered in 15,000 years of being present in a world that made durability difficult. She turned and walked back into Lothlorien. Behind her, Middle-earth continued. Saruman rode south toward Isengard and his furnaces and the answer he was building that no one had asked for. Mithrandir turned east toward the road that would eventually, in his unhurried way, bring him back to the Shire and the small people he had decided mattered. Elrond returned to Rivendell and his library and the long work of remembering everything that needed to be remembered. The Dunedain wandered their wilderness and kept their watch and did not know yet what they were keeping it for. In the east, in the silence and the patience of something that had survived its own destruction twice and was learning from both survivals, Sauron waited. And in the Shire, in the comfortable holes and the well-tended gardens and the complete absence of anything that resembled heroism or destiny or the grand movements of ages, hobbits lived their small and unhurried lives, unaware that they were being watched with interest by a wizard who had concluded, after 1,000 years of paying attention to the wrong scale of things, that smallness was not the opposite of significance. It was, he had begun to think, its precondition.